Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
From the window of the hospital room I could see the chimneys of the factory, which had been raining for a week. It was gloomy and damp, so even walking around the small green courtyard was no fun. Jason felt like he was slowly dying, and, admittedly, he had reason to think so. He'd been rich and happy until a few months ago. Life had seemed so wonderful, any dream, traveling, buying expensive things without thinking about the price. But all that wasn't enough when illness came into his life. Continuing research, the doctor divorced his hands at every question of his wealthy patient Jason Deborah. Endless procedures, tests, visits to specialists. Jason was so tired of it all. Given that it wasn't producing any results, his strength was diminishing. He was having unbearable headaches, and he had to fight insomnia with sedatives. He was fading from day to day. At first, his only joy was his wife. He waited for her arrival every day, got out of bed and looked out the window, as long as he had the strength to stand. Of course, he was well cared for, ready to come at the first call, and the ward was more like a room in an expensive hotel. But still, there is nothing more precious than loved ones. It was only when he was sick that Jason realized that his wife was the only one who could visit him, not because of money, connections, or business, but because she cared about him. But for some reason she came less and less often, and the meetings grew shorter, more silent. Annie would sit by his bedside for about 20 minutes, as if it were a heavy duty rather than the desire of a loving wife, and then she would leave on some pretext. Paul says I need brain surgery, but the outcome is 50-50, Jason sadly shared in one of their brief encounters. Oh well, we have to try. After all, Paul isn't just any doctor, he's been in the clinic for 15 years, Annie said affirmatively, looking out the window and thinking about something of her own. I'm afraid of dying, her husband was quite candid. Jason, what are you making up? She asked irritably. But then she came to her senses and said more softly and cheerfully, it's going to be okay, you'll see, touching his arm. Annie got up and started to leave. What, you already? Jason asked. But I just got here, didn't I? Stay a little longer, I've got to go, she replied. I'll come back the other day and stay with you a little longer. The door shut behind her, and outside the window the sun, which had been illuminating the room with golden sunset light all this time, disappeared over the horizon. Twilight was thickening. He felt so sad that Jason cried for the first time in his adult life. He was overcome with fear of dying of illness and the loneliness of those he considered his friends. They had only come once to negotiate the sale of his share of the company. His parents were long gone, and Jennifer had suddenly grown cold to him. But even that coldness wasn't as frightening as her smiles and the satisfied smirks she sometimes allowed herself, forgetting herself. There seemed to be some other life outside this room, some happy place where they were happy. And Jennifer came here as a matter of duty. It would have hurt Jason even more if he'd seen her exhale with relief when she was on the porch of the clinic, waiting hopefully for the car to meet her. All that kept her near her husband these weeks was the huge inheritance she was preparing to receive after his death. It had gotten quite dark, and in the gloom only the red lights of the medical machines and the television could be seen. They could hear people talking in the hallway, and the beams from the headlights of passing cars could be seen on the walls. But Jason was alone, wondering what he had done wrong in his life to die at 32. There was a knock at the door. Then a small female figure appeared in the doorway. An orderly entered the room and brought in her cleaning tools. It's time to go for a walk, she smiled. Can I stay here? I'm not bothering you, Jason said cheerfully. He'd grown fond of these short visits in the last few days, when the older nurse, Darcy Peterson, had gone on sick leave and the positive, red-haired Kathy had taken her place. All right, she agreed. I'll make it quick. You can stay a little longer. I'm all alone in here. Oh, come on, you have so many business people coming to you. Not one patient is not so popular with us. It's all business. Katie's been quick to mop the floor. Take out your flowers. Turn on the TV. That'll make it more fun. And soon Paul Alexandrovich will come to see you, the girl said contentedly. I'm standing at the door with a mop in my hands. "You're good, Kathy. Come in and she'll be cheerful at once. How do you do it?" "I just find something good in everything." She smiled and closed the door carefully behind her. Perhaps no one but Katie had ever been so sincere and straightforward with him, and that made it feel better, if only for a little while, especially since the doctors kept shrugging their shoulders and ordering more tests. And Annie didn't come once a week, and once a week looked into the room, and without taking off her coat, inquired about her husband's health. Not that she listened much to his stories, but he still shared his worries with her. He'd long ago realized that his wife had lost all interest in him, and was talking only out of a sense of duty, or even, that was what Jason was afraid of, pushing the bad thoughts away. Well, his Annie can't be with him only because of the inheritance, not to love him, but hoping he'll get the money soon. Waiting for him to know. That thought he could not endure. Fortunately, his heavy musings were interrupted by Katie's whirlwind, who burst into the room like a fresh breeze on a sweltering day. She was holding a paper bag from the local bakery, and the appetizing aroma of freshly baked goods boded well for Jason. A couple of fresh buns and a sandwich. He'd rarely been able to eat anything really good lately. The hospital food, though prepared for him with care, was far from homemade. "Thank you, Katie," he said sincerely as she helped him up. "Eat up and get well," she winked and placed the table of food on the patient's lap. It was amazing how much of an appetite he suddenly had. Jason thought for a moment that he was sure to get better and get back to business. "Did you go to see him again?" Nurse Irene asked with a chuckle when Katie entered the office. "What's the big deal? And you still don't take any money from him?" "No. What do I need his money for? I'm not doing anything. I'm just being supportive." "Don't worry, you're a lover." "I wouldn't advise it. It's better not to run into his wife." "Sure," incredulously stretched the woman. "Why do you say that?" Katie was indignant. "I'm not going anywhere." Irene had hinted at extra fees for almost all the wealthy patients at their clinic. Jason was no exception. Maybe that was why she found it hard to believe in Katie's sincerity. That same evening, his wife visited him. An expensive black car was waiting for her at the entrance, and she was dressed smartly, as if she were going to a restaurant or the theater. "How are you?" she asked impatiently, going over her gloves in her hands. "You know, not bad," Jason replied in a weak but cheerful voice. "Played a game of chess with one man today. He's in the next room over and he's going crazy with idleness too." "Good," she nodded her head. "I've been meaning to ask you. Anyway, I've run out of money in my account. I need to buy a couple things right away. Can you call the bank okay after that?" Jason, you couldn't tell anything from his facial expression, but his heart dropped. He called his assistant, and after arranging everything, he looked at her. All set. "Can you go?" "Thank you, darling," she replied and left. Left alone, Jason felt the terrible headache again. At his moans, a nurse came running in, followed by Paul seeing a dose of painkillers. They watched him for a few more minutes and left, leaving him alone with his gloomy thoughts. "Kathy, I have a favor to ask of you," Jason addressed the nurse during the morning cleanup. "Excuse me, dear." A smile lit up the girl's face, but the next moment it was immediately gone. "I'm going to die soon and I just can't help but think about my funeral." No, don't say anything, please. My wife and co-workers will do everything hastily. Or maybe they won't do it at all." "Jason, Dimitri, what on earth are you talking about?" Katie couldn't take it anymore. "What death? What funeral?" "You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. You're a very good, kind girl. Kathy, I've never met anyone like you in my life. But still, I beg you, go to the funeral home, book, and make the arrangements. Pick out the casket, the wreaths, the clothes. But what else is required there?" He spoke so earnestly that good-natured Kathy could not refuse. Paul had ordered her to leave work early for the afternoon, and her friend Irene was already talking about it. "There she goes again, with all her favors and all her secrets," she told the other nurses. "You'll see we'll have a scandal on the ward over this." Jennifer's not going to be happy. Going to the funeral home was awkward and scary. Katie had never had to choose such items before. She decided she wouldn't take the responsibility, but would take some catalog and let Jason decide on the casket and burial clothes if he wanted to. She walked to the closest bureau to the hospital, stepped around a parked black car, and opened the door with trembling hands. The first thing that caught her eye were the numerous wreaths of artificial branches and flowers hanging on the walls. After running her eyes over them, she looked in surprise at the man and woman talking to the counselor. Annie was standing near the counter. Next to her, a tall young man, dressed smartly in a dark blue jacket, perfectly ironed pants and leather boots. His companion was not far behind. She wore an elegant black dress, a coat, high-heeled shoes, and a shining necklace around her neck. Their faces expressed sorrow and sadness. Katie stepped closer. "Yes, let's stop there with the roses." The woman pointed her finger at the picture. "We'll write to my beloved husband on the ribbons." At this point, Annie pulled a handkerchief out of her pocket and held it to her eyes. Was she actually crying or wiping away dry eyes? Katie didn't figure it out. Seeing her like that, shocked, she immediately turned around and walked out, circling the brazenly parked car again. She headed home, taking advantage of the unexpected free time she had. They were having a merchandise update right now. They asked her to come back in a week. She lied to Jason all the previous evening. Katie wondered if she should tell him about the funeral home meeting. After all, it was unlikely she had another husband who had passed away unexpectedly. It was more likely that she'd chosen a wreath for Jason with that regretful look on her face. What is this? The wife has already buried her husband in absentia, but the tongue did not turn to tell such a person who lost the will to live. Not only are his loved ones not visiting him, they're preparing to bury him. Annie showed up a couple days later. As always, beautifully dressed in a cloud of exquisite perfume. She walked past Katie without even noticing, or even giving the rich man an attentive glance. What on earth was she up to? Jason spoke a little worriedly at first, but solemnly, as if he had prepared for this speech in advance. "I have an idea, and I think you'll like it." "What idea?" he asked without enthusiasm, turning his face toward the window and looking at the treetops that retain their golden foliage. "The doctors can do nothing. How many treatments have we had?" "I've lost count. Treatment, no results. So I thought maybe you could go to the country for a while, live in nature, get away from these hospital walls." "I'll think about it." Jason turned and looked hopefully at his wife, expecting to see sympathy on her face, but there was none. She smiled coldly, rising from her chair. "You don't love me anymore." "What nonsense is this?" "Of course I do," she said with a poorly concealed effort. "I'm just tired, Jason, I'm tired. I have to deal with all your clients, your investors, your employees. It's exhausting." A week later, Jason was discharged at their request, and his wife took him to the village where a house had been bought for him. As he watched the trees and fields outside the window, he kept replaying the words he had heard in his head. During his last days at the clinic, Jason Dimitri had told him in a conspiratorial tone, "Irene, stopping by for 5 minutes. Apparently to give this information, I heard such a thing today." "What is it?" He turned grudgingly, preoccupied with his own fate. Jason was planning to agree to the surgery the doctor had insisted on. "I overheard your doctors talking today. They agreed not to tell you, of course, but that's cheating. What are you, after all?" Jason was angry. "You don't have more than 2 weeks to live." Irene poked him resentfully and walked away. That news hit him the hardest. He dismissed all thoughts of the surgery, almost stopped eating, stopped caring for himself. Calling his wife, Jason asked her to come and informed her of his decision to move into the country house, adding to himself, "But even those. Jason, why are you doing this? Do you need treatment?" Katie was worried when she heard the news of the patient's imminent discharge. "There's no need for treatment, Kathy," he answered. "I'll be dead soon." "What makes you think that?" "Stay," the nurse urged. Finally, she decided to make one last argument. "Do you know why I came back with nothing? When you sent me to the funeral parlor, because I met your wife and a man there, and they were choosing a wreath for you." "Well, they're absolutely right." "It's about time," Jason said indifferently. "What could I do with him?" Kathy asked him to take her number so he could call her if he needed help. After he left, Katie couldn't find a place to be. "Oh, calm down," Irene told her. When was the last job she didn't have time to clean, and in half the offices assigned to her? Who is he to you to worry so much? There's something wrong with this story, you know? I can't just take it and not think about it. You've got no business of your own. Go to work. Those rich people will sort it out for themselves," Irene said. She's a noble one, isn't she? She doesn't want any money. She's worried sick. I don't understand you. Kathy was upset. She suddenly felt very uncomfortable being around her coworker. And about the money, you took something from them. But you did, Irene replied proudly. It's a sin not to take from someone like that. What's going on in their family? It's none of my business. And you stay out of it, you'll be the least of it. What did you take them for? Katie asked without her former friendly tone. Oh, that's a very funny story, Irene laughed. His wife must have been playing a trick on him and asked me to casually say, "You've only got 2 weeks left." You should have seen the look on his face. Are you out of your mind? Katie boiled up, glaring angrily at her former friend. She walked out and slammed the door behind her. How she wished she had asked Jason for his phone number. For 2 weeks she hadn't known where he'd been taken, what was happening to him, or if he was even alive. In the meantime, Jason was settling into his new home. It was an old house with simple furnishings, but cozy and bright. She promised to come every other day, to hire a nurse and a groundskeeper. She disappeared almost immediately, so I had to do it myself. Strangely enough, Jason did feel better. The silence, the coolness of autumn, the vast vistas outside the window, the scent of apples and honey, all of it transported him back to his childhood, to his grandmother's little house where he'd spent his summer vacations. On the other hand, a heavy, painful desire to say goodbye to everything was growing inside. Without wanting to, he did not want to die, especially alone, abandoned by everyone and needed by no one. It was not easy to get up and move. But that was half the trouble. The house was full of unpleasant surprises that could be found anywhere. On the first day, Jason walked into the kitchen and fell into the basement with 1 foot, miraculously not breaking anything. When he got up, he examined the broken piece of flooring and noticed that it had been purposely filed down, repairing the floor. Jason started cooking. He turned on the stove, put a pot on it, and went to lie down to build up his strength for the soup. He couldn't rest, though, because soon a strange odor of burning meat wafted from the kitchen. The portable tank had suddenly sprung a leak. That's the last thing we need. I'll have to buy an electric stove, Jason said to himself, and then he grinned. Just when I'm about to die, there's a stove. When he entered the bedroom in the evening, the master sensed something slowly and silently moving on the carpet beside the bed. He came closer to examine the strange creature, but immediately recoiled in fear. On the floor, twisted in a ring, lay a brown snake with a red fanciful pattern. Where would a viper come from in the house? This circumstance absolutely threw him off his guard. The time was late, he was alone, and he knew no one in the village. He didn't know what other traps these rooms held. Overcoming his fear, Jason opened the window, took the heavy cotton blankets left by the previous owners, and threw them at the snake. The snake fell silent, giving him the opportunity to grab it and throw it outside. The rustling of leaves between the trees in the garden made a movement from the window into the thicket. The uninvited guests disappeared into the darkness. Jason lay awake until morning, listening to every rustle. The next day he tossed and turned between wanting to call a cab to town and not wanting to do anything about it. The feeling of hopelessness and lack of energy only made itself felt in the evening, spent from a sick sleep. He was able to get up, wash his face, and organize some sort of dinner for himself. There was no more energy for anything else. He lay down on the couch. Suddenly the ceiling shrieked. From above came sounds like quick, small footsteps. Another night of no sleep, Jason asked aloud. He got to his feet, threw his jacket over his shoulders, and went to find out what wonders the attic had in store for him. However, it was impossible to do so. As he climbed the few wooden steps up, the whole structure collapsed. Jason fell with it, and now he was lying on the dusty floor, not knowing what to grab onto. His head ached from the impact. His leg burned with fire. It was only half an hour later, when the pain subsided, that he was able to crawl to the door and sneak inside. Realizing he couldn't do it alone, Jason dialed his wife's number. Then he dialed several friends, but ironically they were all either unavailable or answered with a series of long beeps. Lying on the floor, Jason stared at the ceiling, wondering how he'd gotten to this point. Scenes of their lavish wedding, to which about 100 guests had been invited, their vacation at the seashore, the purchase of a car, conferences, and business meetings appeared before his eyes. He felt success and good fortune dissolving into thin air as the brilliant future he had planned lost its shape. Who is he now? What does he live for? There was one more number in the phone book that he wanted to call, but something prevented him from doing so. The sun was already out of the window, and dusk was settling in when Jason made up his mind. "Katie, hello. You recognize me, of course. How are you?" "I've been so worried about you." She sounded so warm that he sighed. How nice it would be to see her again right now in this very house. Then all the problems would go to the back of his mind. "It's okay. I'm living it up, getting high. It's nice and quiet here," he began cheerfully, "except that I fell down the stairs and hurt my leg trying to call someone, and I can't get up." "So it's not a fracture?" Katie was worried. "I don't think so, but it hurts to get up. I'll come over." Is that okay? I'd really appreciate it." "Don't apologize. It's my pleasure." The room seemed brighter and cozier after those words. Tomorrow he wouldn't be alone. Tomorrow a girl with shiny red hair and an infectious smile would appear here, break the agonizing silence, dispel the painful atmosphere and the fear of death. Paul Alexander was angry for some reason when Kathy asked him for one of her 4 days off. "There's no one to work, and you give a day's notice. That's not how things are done, Catherine." "But I really have to. I do have someone I need to help." "I understand that, but I can't replace you. I have an important patient coming in tomorrow. Everything has to be perfect, so go to work." "Paul Alexander, I've been working 2 years without vacation or time off. Can Darcy Peterson take my place?" "No vacations at home, no vacations, and some people don't even get a day off." "Darcy Peterson can't leave because, again, a solid patient is coming in. I need a young, beautiful staff in the meantime. So a very good person has to suffer because of the whims of your rich patient." Katie couldn't take it anymore. She had never let herself talk to her boss like that before, even though she knew about all his machinations and had been regularly supplied with that knowledge until recently. "Something wrong. Write a statement." "Calculating accounting indifferently," replied Paul, hoping, apparently, that the threat would have a quick effect. "Okay," Katie calmly replied. She was so angry that she actually packed her things and went to write her resignation letter. Having worked honestly at the clinic for so many years, she had never expected to be treated like this. "I'll find something better. I have experience." Yes, they would take her to any other institution, she explained to her colleagues. Gathered in the corridor, just sitting on the bus on the way to the village, Katie reprimanded herself for this act. It would take time to find a job, and what would she live on if she lost her only source of income? On the other hand, it felt like a relief. It was like a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. This job, without vacations and sick days, had been wearing her down for a long time. Paul's words were the last straw. A familiar village flew past, and Katie pressed herself against the window to catch a glimpse of the White House behind the trees. Almost at the very edge of the street, it was where she'd spent her childhood. Her heart ached at the memory. She wanted badly for the bus to slow down near the dilapidated red brick bus stop. The doors opened and my mother came in with a full basket of mushrooms and birch branches, from which she would deftly assemble large bath brooms. The family lived poorly, and it was from this very poverty that Katie had gone to the city and entered medical school. But now she would give anything to sit with her mother once more at the table in their small kitchen, drink mint tea, sleep on the stove, and lie down longer in the morning. Listening to the wood crackle on the stove, nostalgic, Katie didn't notice when she reached the village where Jason lived. It wasn't hard to find his house. She stepped inside and found him lying on the couch, covered by a thin blanket. The man was dozing on the couch. The room was a mess. The blanket was lying on the floor. There was a plate of food and a mug of tea under the bed. Katie felt sorry for Jason. The whole place was a testament to the fact that he had been sent here to live out his life, forgotten by everyone. Desperate, he didn't look like himself at this minute. "Hello, Katie," Jason cheered, waking up. "Hello, how are you here?" As you can see, he looked around the room with his gaze, although I still feel better here than I did in the hospital by evening the house. as well as its sole occupant, began to look noticeably better. There were tablecloths on the tables, curtains on the windows, and the kitchen smelled of baked potatoes and vegetables. Jason cheered up. "I miss a proper home-cooked meal," he asked twice for more, leaving him to rest. Katie went in search of the store. Fortunately, it didn't take long to find it. There were people crowded in front of the little blue house with the grocery sign. They all gave the newcomer an attentive stare, obviously trying to understand who she was and who she had come to see. "Oh, what a beautiful girl. Do we have someone's granddaughter?" the clerk asked, pulling out cereal, butter, bread, and other items on the list. "Katie, I'm here to see Jason Dimitri. He lives on the outskirts. Maybe you know him." "You wouldn't know. A new guy doesn't get to know anybody. He doesn't go out too much." "Is it hard for him to go out? Does he get sick?" "Well, yes," nodded a large man at the counter, the chairman of the local cooperative. "So sick that his wife has already prepared a place for him in the cemetery." "What? How could that be?" Katie was surprised. "That's it. We are, as they say, shocked ourselves. Maybe you're confused. Look for yourself. They dug up her grave there. They called someone from the city." From the sales clerk's face, you could understand that this topic causes superstitious fear in the village. That's why few people dared to stop by Jason's house to meet their new neighbor. But how could they? Can it? The man is alive, and they've almost buried him. Maybe all this weirdness isn't an accident. Katie stayed with him for a week, during which time she got to know the villagers. Next door to Jason's cottage lived Granny, small, quiet, and pleasant to talk to. Katie found comfort in talking to her. She reminded her of her grandmother. It was she who had suggested Jason's unconventional treatment. "If medicine can't help, maybe we should try folk remedies," she said, pouring tea. "What do you mean?" Katie wondered. "There's a healer in the neighboring village. I haven't been there myself. I've heard that people even come to her from the city for help." Jason laughed at the idea, and Katie was eager to try it. "It's not like we're losing anything," she urged. "Let's just test it. Was she really helping, or was it all just talk?" 2 days later, they were on an old, cramped bus that traveled between villages twice a day. They had 3 hours to find the mysterious healer. Otherwise, they wouldn't make it home in time. Wandering the streets and asking locals, Jason and Katie finally reached her. The woman in the place did stand in the distance and greeted her guests unfriendly with tiny dark windows and a drooping wicket. Katie felt uneasy. She was beginning to regret the decision to come here. Jason treated it with the same irony, smiling and joking. It was hard to walk, though, and he was tempted to lie down. There was a light in the window, and footsteps were heard. The door opened, and a woman of about 50, short, in a brown long dress and a light shawl, from under which her black hair was poking out, came out. She spoke quietly, slowly, as if thinking over every word. When she learned the purpose of the visit, she invited the guests into the house. The wooden floor creaked with every step. Light fell from a large window. There were many potted flowers on the windowsill, and a cat sleeping peacefully on the ropes stretched from one wall to another. Collected brooms of herbs were drying. It smelled of chamomile and wormwood. Katie shuddered as something big, sad, and shaggy came out from behind the stove. It sighed and snorted. "Don't be afraid, that's my dog Baron. He is quite old now. He won't bite," said the landlady. The dog Baron lazily looked at the people who came into the house and made a muffled sound resembling barking, spreading his paws wide and walked towards the exit. Once he was outside, the owner invited Jason and Katie to sit down. Just like that, no one knows what it could be. "The only thing that saves us is painkillers," Catherine finished her story. Without knowing the backstory, you'd think that Annie, Jason's wife, was so worried about him. "Well, can I try?" Barbara spoke up after some silence. "We'll probably go," Jason smiled. "The bus is coming soon. We have to get there in time." Kathy looked at him pleadingly, as if begging him to stay at least another minute. "I don't believe in eviction." The landlady addressed him. "I must admit, the whole thing seemed strange to me," Jason replied. "Jason, come on. Please," Katie begged. "All right," he surrendered, unable to withstand her hopeful look. "Barbara, any money I'll pay. As long as you treat all right," she agreed. "I don't need the money." "But there is one request. I'll tell you when you're well deal," Jason replied without hesitation. He was sure he wouldn't have to fulfill the request. The guests stayed the night in Barbara's small hut. Early in the morning, Katie awoke. She peeked out from under the blanket and saw her hostess preparing some kind of potion. There was already a fire burning in the stove. On the stove, something large from a pot exuded the smell of food. The girl closed her eyes and imagined the same old cottage of her grandmother, which always smelled appetizingly of baked goods, dried mushrooms, and raspberry jam. Strangely enough, Barbara was not at all embarrassed by the arrival of the guests. On the contrary, she had persuaded them to move in temporarily because their house was closed for a while. Her yard was bustling with life, with goats scurrying about. A couple of goats from somewhere deep within the buildings. A large black and white cow made a lingering sound that was new to Jason. This kind of environment was new to him. Everything surprised and amused him. He was still alert, but he still had headaches and a terrible weakness that forced him to lie down day and night.
Katie, on the contrary, felt like a fish in water in the village house. She was an excellent housekeeper, skilled in animal handling, milking the cow and stoking the stove. It was getting colder and colder outside. Snow was falling, foreshadowing the imminent winter. A month passed unnoticed by everyone. Barbara showed up with her potions, which she continued to make good-natured fun of, giving Jason a cool compress when he was in a lot of pain.
And she made him take up hardening. He only really approved of the latter and went outside every morning to douse himself with warm water, gradually lowering the temperature. "I'll be able to swim in the ice hole by winter," he reported, clearing the yard with a shovel. When Kathy returned from the village with her shopping, she stood beside him and looked at him in surprise. "What are you doing?" she asked confusedly. In the time they'd spent together, all three of them had switched to you. "Shoveling snow." "What did you think?" Jason smiled. "Snow," she repeated, as if not understanding the meaning of what he said. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, but it wouldn't hurt to lie down. That was only the first bell." He was indeed getting better every day. And after 2 months, Jason could walk to the store on his own, carrying water and firewood. And on New Year's Day, he cleared out the big tree in the yard, which soon glowed with colorful balls. Katie was childishly excited about New Year's Eve, determined not to think about the future, at least during this vacation. In January, it was decided to return. Katie went to check on the house, putting the place in hasty order. She headed for the exit, but at the door she ran into Annie, who apparently wasn't the first time she'd come, trying to track down her husband. "Who are you?" she asked sharply, squeamishly looking Katie over from head to toe. It didn't matter. Not wanting to talk, she locked the door and walked past. "Where's Jason?" Annie asked, puzzled. Katie turned around at that moment and looked angrily at the diamond-clad rich man in the mink coat.
"You'd probably want him to be in the other world, wouldn't you?" she exclaimed. "What kind of nonsense is that? It's nonsense to order wreaths and dig a grave for a living person. I promise you. You won't get what you want. Jason will be alive and well."
With those words, Katie turned and walked away. She was seething with resentment, and not even the cold winter wind could cool the fire. Annie remained standing, not knowing how to react. The whole business had already been formally taken over by her, and in fact it no longer belonged to him, but was run by her lover. Waiting for recovery was going to get in the way of the ambitious couple, and something had to be done about it. Katie returned and told Jason what had happened, but Jason, inspired by the miraculous rescue, didn't want to fight or revenge. "Let her do what she wants," he said. "God is her judge. I don't care about that now. I need to save my health and start a new life." Feeling energized, Jason set about renovating the house. In addition to his business accounts, he had some savings for a rainy day. His wife didn't know about them, so cashing them out was no problem. Katie planned to get a job on the farm, but in the meantime she was helping him settle in. Now, after his recovery, Jason could confess his feelings to her without fear of condemning her to a lifetime of caring for a hopeless patient. She was happy, and of course reciprocated. Once he had taken care of the household chores, he suggested that Kathy visit Barbara and see what she wanted to ask in exchange for his help. "I've been looking forward to it," she said as she set the tea on the table. "I can't do it alone. Maybe you can." Barbara's daughter had gone to the city in search of a better life, to earn money, if she was lucky. to get married. There were no other options for her in the country but the farm, and that was not a fate she was happy with. After changing several places, Annie found a job with good pay and conditions. Some wealthy man was looking for a maid. Of course, a girl from the backwoods was happy with all this decent money, huge, beautiful houses. Then the employer began to show her signs of attention. I told her, "Give it up, come home. We'll live together. Maybe you'll meet a good, hard-working man," sadly told the witch doctor. But it was as if she didn't even hear. She just said, "Be happy for me. We're happy." And then suddenly she disappeared. A month or two later, I pelted her with letters. She doesn't say a word. When I got there, I realized everything at once. I could already see her belly. Barbara's daughter was pregnant with twins. The boys were born healthy. But the youngest mom had a hemorrhage. They fought for her life for days. "It was the worst day of my life," Barbara cried. "I still can't believe she's gone, and I can't see the boys." "Where are they now? Who are they with?" Jason asked. "Their father took them to his house, but he let me see them. Even brought them here a few times. They're about 10 now. They're big," the loving grandmother said with pride in her voice. "Now he's in jail for something. And my boys are with my stepmother, but she doesn't need them at all. She only needs money. That's all." Jason promised to help. He called up some old friends to get the addresses. 2 weeks later, they sent him all the information and he was on his way to New York for the first time since he'd moved to the village. The apartment where the boys and their stepmother lived was in a new high-rise. Climbing to the 11th floor, Jason rang the doorbell and was opened by a tall, slender brunette. "What do you want?" she asked in a rough, unpleasant voice, and he smelled cigarettes. "I'm looking for Inna Vitalievna," I said. She looked him over and found him attractive. "Are you here?" and flapped her unnaturally long eyelashes. At that moment, 2 blonde heads looked out of the room and looked at the guest with curiosity. Inna turned around and snarled angrily. "Well, go away, stick out. Learn your lessons." "I just came to see them," Jason explained calmly.
To see them? The stepmother's face changed.
"What do you want?" "I want to know why you won't let them see their grandmother." "That's crazy money it took. So tell her she won't get a penny. Now get out of here." "Wait a minute. I'm not waiting for anything. Go away, or I'll scream and call the police." The last thing Jason saw were 2 hopeful eyes staring at him from behind the door. On his way home, he decided to do whatever it took to help the boys get back to their grandmother's house. They would be much better off there than with that woman, and if housing was an issue, he would buy them a house in the village or the nearest town. Jason found a lawyer, and he began to prepare the documents for filing with the court. Now all they had to do was wait until everything was ready. He and Kathy settled down, made repairs, updated the furniture, and thought about opening a small company. And in the spring, a very happy event came to their home. Kathy is pregnant. No sooner had the happy couple rejoiced at this event, as Annie appeared on the threshold of the house, like storm clouds on a warm summer day. She didn't look as smug as usual. "I really need your help," she said. Quietly, Jason led her outside. "I thought I'd already done everything for you," he said, smiling slightly. "Isn't there more to it? You couldn't steal my money?" "Jason, I'm sorry. Life has punished me for everything. All right, tell me what happened, and then we'll go." "Alex was taken hostage." "Do you understand?" she cried. "Alex who? Who took him hostage?" "Explain. I don't understand." "Their business problems started a month ago. But the current managers, Alexander and part-timer Lover, to the last convinced everyone that nothing terrible would happen. They decided to open a food market next to the existing one. And the competitors did not keep waiting. The owners started receiving threats. Annie got a phone call that morning. She told the story in bits and pieces, interrupted by sobs. Alex had been kidnapped and demanded a ransom equal to the value of the business she had fraudulently inherited from her ex-husband. "Are you sure about that, Alex?" Jason asked. "Don't be jealous," Annie asked. "I love him more than life. I won't let anything happen to him." "No, let's go to the police."
Annie jumped up, grabbed her bag, and started for the door. Her face was red with anger and fear.
I came to you for help, not for you to talk me out of it. She never showed her face at Katie's again. Jason settled into his quiet life. The house shone clean. There was a small vegetable garden and fruit orchards, and a nice fence around the property. A new gate had been installed, and all the villagers passed by and admired it. Jason seriously considered opening a company, bought the place from the collapsed collective farm, hired employees to rebuild the cowshed and clear the area of garbage. Kathy decided to take veterinary courses and planned to get a lot done before giving birth. Everything was going well, but there was one thing that wouldn't budge. Barbara was still waiting for her grandchildren to come home, and her stepmother wasn't planning to give them up so easily. The lawyer had filed a petition with the court, then prepared appeals, gathered a mountain of documents, but the decision had gotten bogged down somewhere in the paperwork to make it stick. Jason found out where the twins' father was serving time and went there himself. It wasn't without difficulty that he managed to arrange a meeting. The man was seriously ill, lying in the hospital wing. The prisoner seemed to be a broken man, but retained the remnants of his former beauty. He took a breath after descending the stairs and scrutinized the visitor, trying to understand what business he might have come for. That's it, the prisoner exhaled after Jason's story. I'm all in favor of the boys living with their grandmother. You can be sure they didn't give up. I've arranged for them to get money every month, so she's getting her lips done with it. He said it without offense, but with irony. Jason was reminded of Ina's artificial appearance and her swagger. Aren't you hoping to get out of here early? No, I've already got lung cancer, he said, and then added sadly, life is coming to an end. I left money for the boys. They each have their own account. They'll get it after 18, and Barbara Alexievna will get it too. You give me the amount, I'll tell you where it is. They can't live in a hut in the middle of the woods. With the father's written permission to take the children, it was much easier. And in a couple of weeks after this trip, they were already running along the dusty country road to their grandmother's new house. By this time, she had baked pies and walked from window to window, waiting for her favorite granddaughters. After living with a hateful stepmother, the boys were happy to be near their own person. Barbara loved them with all of her heart. She was kind and allowed them all the joys of village life, to pitch a tent in the garden, to lie on the roof and look at the stars, to go fishing early in the morning, to sleep on a bed with Irene on the veranda. She also took Jason's word that they wouldn't leave the twins if anything happened to her. I'm not an old woman. It's scary if my grandchildren end up with strangers again, she told the couple. And they agreed without question, even though they argued, saying, don't think about bad things before you think. How did she give them to you? Katie wondered after they got back from town. Hardly, Jason answered. She was so hysterical. It scared me, not to mention the kids. She said she was going to destroy me. And was it really about the money? Now everyone wanted to forget about the past and start over, and there were plenty of reasons to do so. Katie was expecting a baby. The first calves had arrived on the farm, and there were plenty of people wanting to work. There'd been no jobs in the village for a long time. An opportunity came along. But the past stubbornly persisted, reminding her of herself again and again. One fine morning, Annie Zadorazny appeared on the doorstep with a bag in her hands. It was hard to recognize her. No fancy clothes, heels, jewelry, and makeup, only bags under her eyes. From the bag on her shoulders and the sad look in her eyes, Jason could easily guess that she'd given the business to those very thugs. But where was her beloved Alex? What's wrong with you? He asked, stepping out into the yard. Jason, I came to see you, Annie replied. Why? I don't understand. I need a place to live. I'm ready to work. I thought you were back in business. Where's your lover? Jason, he betrayed me when someone asked me to ransom him. It wasn't true. He conspired with them, and I was just being played. Annie cried. I see. Well, can I offer you a job as a milkmaid? It's all I've got. She stayed. It was better for her to live with her ex-husband than to try to start from scratch. Of course, Katie resented this arrangement, but she kept her feelings in check so as not to make herself and Jason unnecessarily jealous. It was almost 2 months before the birth, and everyone was looking forward to meeting the baby. Katie sewed diapers and bonnets. Jason had brought the crib and planned to assemble it soon. The twins were inventing new games and making rattles, which Barbara filled with fragrant herbs. Everyone had joy and anticipation of a miracle. Just not Annie. The dirty work made her appearance rougher and her character more withdrawn. Contrary to expectations, she did not leave. In her first month of hard labor, she continued to persevere on the farm, doing everything she was asked to do. On a winter evening, Katie sat at home. Her husband had left for town in the afternoon and must have decided to stay there until morning, for a blizzard was raging outside. The roads had turned to snowdrifts in a matter of hours, and the wind was howling drearily from the window. When she heard footsteps outside the door, Katie was glad that Jason had probably come home. He was always calmer with her. She'd been feeling sick to her stomach all day, and it was frightening. It was a few kilometers to the hospital, but Annie appeared at the door, wearing felt boots and a woolen shawl over her hat. What happened to you, Katie thought, remembering the diamond-clad beauty walking proudly down the corridor in heels. Are you alone? It's cold, asked the guest. What did you want? I wanted to tell you something that you might have guessed yourself that you don't understand. Katie tried to remain calm, her temples throbbing unpleasantly, and her stomach tugged unbearably again. Oh, come on. I've never noticed Jason coming home late from work, Annie said with cold gloating. He works hard, Katie replied, getting up from the couch and going to the window, hoping to see her husband. Unfortunately, there was nothing but thick darkness. He wants a naive, stupid fool. I'm tired of running from him, though sometimes I can't help myself. I'll be honest with you. Annie smiled, pleased with the effect she was having on Katie, but soon the smile faded, replaced by alarm and, finally, horror as the pregnant woman suddenly grabbed her stomach and sat on the floor, letting out an inhuman scream. Annie ran up to her and tried to turn her around, but she pushed her away with force. Get out, Katie screamed, still holding her stomach. I'm dying. Should I call Barbara? The milkmaid was completely freaked out. She hadn't gotten up in 2 days. Katie exhaled. The contraction passed, but the next one came. It was clear to both of them that labor had begun, and no one could help them. This frightening thought left Annie in a stupor. For several minutes she stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do or where to run. Finally, gathering her thoughts, she went to the closet, opened it, took out the sheets and spread them on the floor, moving Katie onto them. The forced midwife went to the kitchen and washed her hands thoroughly. Found a towel and diapers. Coming with a desire for revenge, Annie quickly realized her new role. There was no escape. All disagreements and grudges were best left for later. Katie cried, moaning, the cool compress on her forehead instantly warming. She was thirsty. Calling for Jason, her train of thought was more like the ramblings of a sick man. The night was going to be hard, endless, agonizing. The first thing Jason heard when he entered the house in the morning was the cry of a baby. His heart quickened. For a few moments he stood in the hallway as if afraid to move. The arrival of his daughter was a surprise he had not expected to receive that morning. It was no less of a surprise that Annie was giving birth to a girl. And Katie, covered in a warm blanket, was resting on the bed. She smiled and held out her hand to him. How I thought it was early, Jason mumbled confusedly. She rushed at Katie, answered him in a weak voice. The experience of childbirth was a life-changing one, not only for the laboring woman herself, but also for her longtime detractor. We see the fear she experienced that night. Something changed in her soul. Annie became even more withdrawn and silent, and soon surprised everyone with a new decision. I'm going into a convent. I've already written a letter, and I've been told they're waiting for me. You've decided that, Jason marveled. You can't make it up. I need a secretary in the office right now. Thought I'd offer you one. No. It's already decided, she replied calmly. And after asking to be left alone with Katie, said, I'm sorry for everything. I'm going away to absolve myself of my sins beforehand. I want to apologize right away. Jason, I didn't cheat on you. I made it up at the time to hurt you. I thought you were the cause of all my troubles, but you weren't. and she left, apparently finding herself in ministry. In letters, she regularly reported that she was living well. She promised to come visit by summer. It took Jason and Kathy a long time to get used to it, but in time they accepted it as it was. They named their daughter Barbara. The girl, with the same red hair and funny ears as her mother's, grew up to be a fun-loving, naughty girl. Especially her appearance pleased the twins. They did not dote on her. They fulfilled all requests and took her with them on important tasks, such as hammering apples or eating currants from the neighbors' bushes. In a few years, the farm had grown to the size of a large farm and was already bringing the owners a good income. The road they had built to the village carried daily loads of milk, eggs, hay, and straw. Jason, who had started with zero knowledge, was suddenly one of the most experienced farmers in the area, and he was very proud of it. Past sufferings lost their former meaning: a cozy and hospitable house, a friendly family. Now they had everything for real happiness.
Sarah ran down the street with her heart racing. She was late. But how could this be happening now? During the night, her phone had run out of battery, and the alarm clock, of course, did not ring on time. When the girl opened her eyes, she immediately realized that she had overslept. It was too light outside. Luckily, she had prepared her dress from the evening, and it didn't need to be ironed. Of course, she wanted to do light makeup, but under the severe time constraints, that would do. Sarah hastily tied a high ponytail and managed to eat a sausage sandwich. Yes, it was unhealthy, calorie-dense food. But in her early 20s, she was clearly not in danger of becoming overweight. And now the girl did not walk, but ran along the sidewalk, almost flew to the bus stop. If the bus was a little late, she could still make it. She really needed to get to the interview. There weren't many people around. The streets seemed unusually deserted. It was a busy time. Everyone had already gotten to work, and lunch was still a long way off. If Sarah had more time, she would have loved to see the bright colors in the flower beds and the leaves on the trees starting to turn yellow. The beginning of fall is the most beautiful season of the year. But the girl was hopelessly late because of her own short-sightedness. How could she forget to put her phone on the charger? Sarah quickened her pace. She needed to make a good impression on her employer. Otherwise, the girl didn't know what to do. Her life had never been sluggish, but lately things had gotten quite bad. Some kind of black streak with no end and no edge. But Sarah was not discouraged. She knew for sure that at her young age one must move forward. A black streak is followed by a white one. You just have to do something about it. Besides the fact that she did not whine and did not feel sorry for herself, the girl tried her best. She called all the companies in the city, looking for vacancies, even thinking about part-time work. Accountants, as it turned out, were required few, but much more often flashed vacancies for cleaners. What to do? If you cannot get a job in the profession, you will have to take any job. Money will not earn itself. You can't expect help, but you have to live. When Sarah was fired from the colony, where she had worked in the accounting department for almost 3 years, they tried to console her. "Well, you're still very young," exhorted Susan Smith, the head of the personnel department. "You'll easily find a new position. Who's to be laid off but you? Not Laura, she's raising a son on her own. Or Dolores. She's in her 60s. Who'd hire her at that age? And you're still a child. At least you can live with your parents. They're young and strong. It won't be a big deal if you're out of work for a few months. Get some rest." Susan Smith had no idea how Sarah was doing, but the girl didn't even try to explain anything to her. She knew it was useless. The penal colony where Sarah worked had been downsized, and now the institution did not need 3 accountants at once. Someone in the payroll department had to be fired. She, the youngest, was chosen. Susan Smith said that in case of emergency, the young girl could live with her parents for a while. She gave as an example her daughter, the same age as Sarah, who was studying at the institute, did not work and lived in the care of her mother and father. But Sarah's situation was completely different. True, she didn't talk about it much. Not that she was ashamed. The girl somehow managed to contrast herself with her own mother from an early age. Mother on her own, Sarah apart. But she just wanted to start a new life. It was one thing to present herself in the eyes of new acquaintances as just a girl from the village, and another the daughter of an alcoholic. Sarah was well aware that this fact of biography would definitely affect her image and reputation, and she tried to avoid it. As long as she could remember, her mother always drank. At first, the girl thought that this is normal, quite natural phenomenon. Sarah simply did not know anything else. But as she grew up, she looked around carefully and realized that it was not so. The other children lived in full families, wore new clothes, ate well, were looked after, given gifts. They were taken to the city for rides and movies, and Sarah was literally surviving. Fortunately, a kind-hearted neighbor, Pamela, looked after the girl a little. The old woman often treated Sarah to soup or called her home to warm up when her mother, drunk, closed the door, and the girl could not get home. Pamela periodically tried to reason neighbor Amber, how can you behave like this? You wouldn't get in trouble. Get smart before it's too late. But Sarah's mother either listened to these admonitions in silence or answered the old lady rudely. At such moments, Sarah was very ashamed and offended for Pamela. The girl had such a mother drank in the company of village alcoholics like her. The whole crowd often gathered at their house. They would party until morning, making noise, arguing, sometimes even fighting. It really scared Sarah, and she hid in the attic. There she had her own corner, a mattress, a plaid, a pillow, a few books given by neighbors, a flashlight. The girl did not feel safe in the room. Sometimes the mother tried to take up her mind. She even got a job then as a cleaner in the cow shed, then as an assistant in the canteen. The woman was welcomed, knowing that she had a daughter and feeling sorry for the girl. At first, during such periods, Sarah rested. She was reassured that everything would be all right. The house would be clean, and simple but delicious home-cooked food would appear on the table. Amber even paid attention to her daughter, took an interest in her life, made plans together. Sometimes she promised to take Sarah to the city, to the movies or amusement parks, but it never came to that. The mother snapped again, and everything returned night drinking, complete indifference to her daughter. Sarah grew up neglected. Sarah didn't know her father, but she hoped he was a prosperous, good man. Though there was little chance of that. Her mother had been very beautiful when she was young, until she started drinking heavily. Sarah had seen old pictures of her. Maybe she had a great pure love then, the fruit of which was Sarah herself. Of course, the girl asked her mother about her father, but she invariably replied that she herself did not know who he was. She had a busy, fun life then to memorize and keep track of such little things. Fortunately, Amber had no more children. The first birth was complicated. Sarah grew up without siblings. Once she wanted a kindred, understanding person next to her together perhaps would be easier and more fun. But then the girl realized that all for the best. It is not worth her mother to become a large family if she does not follow one child. Sarah had never known her father and realized that she would never know. Not knowing allowed her to hope. The girl dreamed that the second half of the genes inherited from her father turned out to be more successful than the inheritance from her mother. Sayings like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree frightened her. Was she destined to be like Amber? But no way. Teachers, seeing the efforts of a child from a disadvantaged family, tried to support the student. Someone studied with her additionally. Someone bought some aids for the girl with his own money. Many people were interested in Sarah's fate. Once, when Sarah was finishing the 8th grade, she was summoned by the principal. Sarah went to the office, causing awe and terror in most school children, completely calm. The girl's conscience was clear, and Nicole was a balanced, calm woman who always wished Sarah only good. "Come in, sit down." The principal smiled broadly and offered the girl to sit in the chair opposite her. That day they talked about Sarah's future. Nicole had suggested a wonderful option to enroll after 9th grade at a school in the city. Some friend of hers worked at the institution who could arrange a place in the dormitory for a country girl. Just imagine you'll live in the city, in a clean room to study. Then you'll find a job. Will you get married? Everything depends on you now. Will you manage? You'll have a good, happy life, Nicole said. Scared of hardship? You realize you have no prospects in our village. Look at your mother. Of course, Sarah would manage. She had no doubt about it. The prospects were breathtaking. A bright future loomed ahead. She wouldn't have to live forever in a cold, dirty house, where some unpleasant people, her mother's companions, were always crowding around. Sarah was sincerely grateful to the director for such an offer and participation in her destiny, and decided that as soon as she became successful, wealthy, and she did not imagine otherwise, she would return to the village and give Nicole a mink coat. At that time, Sarah associated this item of closet with wealth and luxury. The year flew by. Sarah studied very hard, preparing for college. Her teachers helped her as much as they could. The mother, well, she behaved as usual, brought friends to the house, did not work. The woman lived and walked on the allowance that the state paid her as a single mother. The whole village collected Sarah for college. Her neighbors gave her clothes from their grown children, provided her with money for the first time, and wished her a happy journey. "Find yourself a nice guy from a nice family," Grandma Pamela insisted. "And don't come back here. There's no more life for you here." Sarah smiled. She was going to accomplish everything on her own, not with the help of some guy from a good family. A new life was just around the corner. The realization of that fact was exhilarating. It even made her dizzy. Then school started. Sarah chose accounting. Nicole advised, saying that Sarah has enough intelligence and accountants are needed in every organization, so the girl would not stay without a job. Sarah couldn't believe what was happening to her for a long time. She lived in a clean, spacious room with 2 roommates, ate well in the dining hall, received a scholarship, which she could spend on clothes and textbooks, and studied. Sarah gave herself completely to her studies. She had to become not just an accountant, but the best accountant. She had no margin for error. Sarah made warm friendships with her classmates and roommates. But from student parties, the girl invariably refused. There was nothing wrong with having fun on the weekend, of course. But the noise, the clinking of glasses, drinking, laughter, all this caused unpleasant associations. Sarah involuntarily drew parallels with what was happening at home, and nausea came to her throat. The girl vaguely realized that she had been traumatized by a difficult childhood, and something had to be done about it. But not now. The main thing now was to study and find a good job, so that she would never return to the village again. She had nowhere to go back to. 3 years of study flew by unnoticed. The girl matured, got used to the city. She was considered the best student of the course. And that's why the teachers helped her with employment. The place, of course, was not the most prestigious, a penal colony on the outskirts of the city. But she, a girl with no experience, was taken, as they say, right off the street. And the salary was promised to be stable, not very large, but with quarterly and annual bonuses. This money was enough for rent, transportation, and food. Sarah didn't dream of more. The girl rented a small apartment near the new place of work, and a new stage in her life began. Sarah still could not believe that she had become so mature and independent. How wonderful it is to be a child. The bad. Children are defenseless. They are totally dependent on their parents. With mom and dad, it's just a matter of luck. Sarah wasn't lucky. But now she thought. Now the girl was quite consciously enjoying her new position. She was a correctional officer, an adult, independent. Sarah couldn't believe what was happening to her. Her life would be whatever she wanted it to be. Sarah loved her job. At first, she was put behind the cash register. She didn't have much to do here. Except for the end of the month, when all the staff of the institution lined up for salaries and bonuses. On such days, she even had to stay late. It was here, near the cash register, that Sarah met Ben. The girl often saw this guy in the building. She liked his smile, so warm, open. He himself was short, skinny, not particularly noticeable. But the smile and the gray eyes seemed to be sly. And they definitely attracted attention. The girl knew that the guy worked as a driver, saw how he gave rides to the colony staff. He caused her some previously unexplored feelings. Sarah could not explain to herself what it was. She only liked to meet this man in the corridor. He always looked at her carefully, studying her, interested. And this look gave Sarah a pleasant chill in her stomach and made her palms sweat, an inexplicable reaction of her body. One day, a handsome guy met Sarah in the hallway. In his hands was a bouquet of beautiful flowers. It was later that the girl found out that he was tearing them from the flower. The guy smiled. His cheeks showed charming dimples. For the most beautiful girl in the world. Sarah felt a wave of warmth. The girl silently accepted the flowers. She even lost her voice in surprise. But the guy's eloquence was enough for 2. "You are incredibly beautiful," Ben complimented her. "And yet quiet, modest. My kind of girl. Would you mind if I took you for a walk?" "I'd love to." Sarah was too hasty. At that moment, she felt the happiest in the world. "Then give me the address. I know you live around here, don't you?" 8 o'clock sharp. I'll be waiting for you at the door." And he did. Sarah came out before the appointed time, but Ben was already sitting on the bench, his long legs stretched far forward in his sneakers. That evening they both walked all around the neighborhood eating ice cream, laughing, talking about everything in the world. Ben was a great conversationalist with a well-tongued tongue. Sarah, always a little stiff, felt at ease and free with him. It was like magic. The girl told Sarah about her childhood. He had a way of being sincere, probably because he didn't hide anything himself. Calmly said that he grew up in an orphanage and was not the most calm and obedient child, even in juvenile detention for theft. But then he got smart, studied to be a driver, found a job. He worked at a bakery. True, there he was framed by more experienced, clever colleagues, set up in such a way that Ben's shift lost money for products. Why, it was easy to think I was the guy, he grinned. A stint in juvie and orphanage. You couldn't find a better candidate for the role of a scapegoat. That's how I ended up back in juvie. I don't get it. Sarah, you had to do time again? Yeah, but my time wasn't up yet. What do you mean? It's like this. Didn't you know that? I thought you did. I'm a prisoner in a penal colony, serving my sentence. It's not a heavy sentence, so I work for the colony, I get a little money. The locals even let me into town, like today, for example. Sarah couldn't believe what she'd just heard. So this nice, friendly guy is a prisoner. What difference does that make, really? Ben is still the same charming, smiling, intelligent, very pleasant conversationalist. And Sarah obviously likes him. And the fact that he's in a penal colony, well, who doesn't? A guy was framed, and there's no one to stand up for him, just like there's no one to stand up for her. And in general, she and Ben have a lot in common: a difficult childhood and the need to make their own way in this life. Sarah decided that Ben's status didn't mean anything to her. The only thing that matters is that he's a good man, and he is. Even the staff trusts him. They let him go out on the town. "I've only got 4 months left on my sentence," Ben said. "Then I'll get out, get a job, and start a new life. I have a lot of plans." Ben and Sarah started dating. The girl fell in love with the cheerful, charming guy more and more every day. With him she felt beautiful, needed, loved, special, a very unfamiliar, but very pleasant feeling. Ben tried to help Sarah in everything. For example, he looked for people who had to sign her papers. He drove her wherever she needed to go, carried heavy folders for her from the archives, brought her delicious buns from the canteen. He was always there for her. From time to time, Ben was released in the city, and then he took the girl to the movies, cafes, theater. Sometimes they just wandered the streets, talking about all sorts of topics. However, with Ben, it was pleasant to be quiet. 4 months went by quickly. Ben was released and moved in with Sarah. Where else would he go? It was impossible to live in the apartment, which he had received as an orphan when he was released from the orphanage. It was in an emergency building, from which the bricks were slowly falling out. It was scary to even go in there. Sarah was happy about this turn of events. Now she and Ben lived together like a real family. The guy turned out to be a handyman. He repaired a leaky faucet, changed a light switch, pasted wallpaper. Any job he could do it with his deft hands. And how did Ben cook? The smell of his fried potatoes and mushrooms even made Sarah dizzy. The only thing that marred the idyll was that Ben couldn't find a job. In the morning when Sarah ran away to the office, Ben also left the house and ran to interviews until the evening. But when she came back from work, she found out that another day had been wasted. "They won't hire me anywhere," the guy shook his head sadly. "After all, 2 convictions and for theft. It's a stigma on me now. I can't get away from it." "I guess you'll find something," Sarah reassured him uncertainly. "Of course we'll get through this." But as time went on, nothing changed. Sometimes Ben had some money from somewhere, like he found a temporary part-time job. He'd unload a truck, then he'd spend a couple days at the market, then he'd work at a construction site. He'd spend it all on booze and snacks. Sarah was worried. Ben, the joker and the soul of the company, liked to have fun too much. He had a lot of friends with whom he often disappeared in bars and cafes. Sarah stayed home because she was tired after work, and she had to get up early in the morning, not like Ben. When the guy had no money, he lived on Sarah's salary. She kept silent, afraid of offending her lover, of spoiling their warm, trusting relationship. but the relationship was somehow imperceptibly changing. She and Ben had clearly drifted apart. Sometimes they couldn't even say a word to each other for an entire evening. No, the girl would have loved to talk to her lover. Sarah was still very attracted to him, whereas he had clearly grown cold to the girl. There was no longer the admiration in Ben's gaze that had once so enticed Sarah. When the girl tried to find out what was wrong, Ben became angry. "Why are you picking at my soul? Can't you see that? I'm going through a rough patch in my life. I've got to prove I'm not a criminal, find a job. And then there's you. But we don't spend enough time together. You're out with your friends all the time? I'm alone." "You should have fun too," Ben said. "You've got a lot of coworkers. You have a job and a paycheck. I'm out with my friends, maybe relieving stress. Do you think it's easy to feel second class? Everyone thinks being an ex-con means you're a lost cause. But they understand me and accept me for who I am. I understand and accept you." One day Sarah came home early and overheard Ben on the phone. He was talking to some woman, calling her Jenny and showering her with compliments. It was very similar to the way he had behaved with her in the first few months after meeting her. Sarah felt an almost physical pain in her chest, but still mustered up the courage to enter the room. Ben was a little embarrassed at first, but then angrily went into the kitchen where he calmly ended the conversation, only to return to the room. "What was that all about?" Sarah asked, trying to make her voice sound as firm as possible. "It was nothing in particular. This girl, I met her in a bar. Her dad's the shop foreman. I'm trying to get a job, you might say." That explanation satisfied Sarah at the time, probably because she really wanted to believe in this logical version. She just needed an excuse. Ben's job didn't work out after all. Despite everything, Sarah still loved Ben and hoped that things would work out between them. It is necessary just to survive this difficult period, and everything will be fine. But the black streak in the girl's life did not think to end. One morning, the chief accountant invited everyone to a meeting and said that there were going to be cutbacks, including the settlement department, where Sarah works. The girl tensed, of course, but she felt out of danger. Sarah worked for two people. She coped with all the cases perfectly. Besides, she was young. There's an older woman in the department. That she was a cousin of the boss, Sarah did not realize at the time. Sarah was not even alarmed when she was called to the HR department. Accountants and HR people have a lot of things in common. Nothing suspicious. But the supervisor informed Sarah of her dismissal. That evening, the girl, barely reaching home, collapsed on the sofa and burst into tears. What injustice. Why should she do this? She thought. Colleagues all day cheered Sarah, assured that she will easily and quickly find a job with an even higher salary. They said that everything was for the best, but they knew absolutely nothing about Sarah's life and situation. She can't be out of work for even 2 weeks. There's no way she could find a new job in that short a time. Business? Ben shook his head sadly. What are we going to live on now? I don't know, Sarah shrugged. You're not making any progress. It's quiet. Who needs an ex-convict? Yeah, that's how we got here, Ben sighed. We'll start looking at vacancies tomorrow, Sarah said, sobbing. I'll find something. I'm sure I will. I don't know. Jobs are hard to come by in the city right now, Ben was right. Sarah had heard that many times, but she hadn't cared about it before. After all, the girl worked in prison. She was absolutely satisfied with everything. Who knew how to pay the rent? Ben continued to lament. It's getting close to the deadline. Are they going to kick us out? No, I have a little savings. Sarah shook her head. She was saving a little from each paycheck, saving for a vacation by the sea. She dreamed of spending a romantic vacation with Ben in a southern resort town. But now this sum will have to pay off the landlord, so that at least not to be without a roof over their heads. Oh, that's good, Ben said. I didn't know that. Because it was a surprise, Sarah smiled sadly. I have the money under my mattress in a blue book. What now? All the next day, Sarah tried to find a job. They sent out resumes to companies in the city. What if she got lucky? What if someone responds? The tired girl returned home only in the evening. Her legs were buzzing and she had a headache. But Sarah knew she'd done all she could today. Ben was gone. He must have gone out with his buddies to a bar or a club or something. Sarah didn't understand how he could be so careless about the future. For her, not having a job was a disaster. And him? He didn't worry, he lived and had fun, enjoyed the little things. Maybe it was that easygoing nature that made Sarah fall in love with Ben. Something was wrong in the apartment. Sarah felt it at once, but only then realized what it was. There were fewer shoes around the doorstep. Ben had left in one pair of sneakers. That was understandable. But where had the other 2 pairs gone? And where was the laptop that Sarah had bought on credit? It always stood on the living room table. The girl, obeying a sudden impulse, opened Ben's clothes closet. There were no jackets, no pants, no sweaters. Slowly, the bitter truth began to reach Sarah. Ben had left, packed his things, and not just his own. He'd taken his laptop too, and disappeared, without even explaining anything to her. Sarah dialed his number, but all she heard in response was a short beep. It looked like Ben had blacklisted her or changed her number altogether. But why? He must have met someone else. Maybe he'd even gone to the same hottie Sarah had overheard talking to him. It hurts, but it's understandable. The only thing I don't understand is why Ben left without saying goodbye, and without saying anything, just ran away. Did what was between them mean nothing to him? The problems with her job suddenly faded into the background. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt a searing, tugging pain in her chest. She couldn't hold back the emotions that had come over her. She burst into uncontrollable sobs, which, as it turned out, had even more unpleasant circumstances. It turned out that Ben had taken the money from under the mattress. The very money that Sarah had planned to spend on the rent. The rent was due in a week. If she didn't, the landlord would kick her out on the street. And go where? Sarah had absolutely nowhere to go. She sat on the floor with her hands on her knees and thought. All sorts of thoughts collided and jumbled in her head. Ben, who was he? An unhappy orphanage boy with a hard fate, or a common criminal who could never be reformed? Had he ever loved her? Or was he just using her? And she, naive fool, didn't understand anything. Would the landlord give her an extension on the payment? Maybe he'd take pity if she explained the situation to him. Or, on the contrary, immediately kick her out the door as an insolvent tenant. Would there be a job for her in this big, uncomfortable city? Sarah quickly tired of her heavy thoughts and fell asleep on the floor in the hallway. There was no strength to crawl to the couch. In the morning, the girl washed her face, combed her hair, ate breakfast, and went to look for a job again. Soon Sarah realized that it was almost unreal to get a job in her profession now, and began to look at other vacancies. Okay, she'd have time to become a great accountant. For now, she had to find any place, as long as it paid money. Sometimes the girl was invited for an interview. They promised to call her back, but never did. And soon Sarah stopped believing these assurances. She searched hard, but to no avail. She had no money left at all. The girl stretched the last packet of groats and a loaf of bread and had no idea what to do next. Her situation was becoming more and more desperate. That's when the call came from the cleaning company. Sarah had been to an interview with them about a week ago. They didn't hire her then. But now there was a vacancy for a cleaning assistant, and the girl got a call back. The woman from the HR department asked Sarah to come in the morning with her documents. Only she warned her not to be late, because they didn't want any non-committal employees. And it should happen that Sarah forgot to charge her phone the day before. In the morning, the alarm clock did not wake the girl in time. She woke up on her own. She looked at her watch and was stunned. And now Sarah flew to the bus stop, not noticing everything around her. Just to make it, just to get to the office on time. She needed this job so badly. Sarah walked hurriedly down the sidewalk. Suddenly, a strange sight caught her attention. A pale, frightened old woman was sitting on the sidewalk. There was horror in her eyes. The old woman was struggling to breathe, a hoarse squeak escaping from her lungs. Sarah stopped, looking around. She should call for help, but there was no one nearby. It wasn't rush hour, so there was no one to help this woman but Sarah. But if she's late for her interview, she's out of a job. Wouldn't you? But Sarah couldn't pass up an old woman in desperate need of help. How can you leave someone in this position? What's wrong with you? The girl squatted down in front of the woman and looked into her face. Sarah D, she said with difficulty. Sarah had never seen people's lips so blue before. An ambulance? She asked. The old woman nodded. Sarah dialed the ambulance number. explained the situation to the dispatcher and gave the address. The deed was done, but she couldn't leave the woman alone on the sidewalk and decided to wait for the ambulance to arrive. Sarah was hopelessly late for her interview. She could forget about the job, which meant there was nowhere to rush and nothing to worry about. "What's your name?" the girl asked, sitting down next to the old woman on the sidewalk. "Deborah," she exhaled. "Thank you, sweetheart. Don't ever leave. I'll sit here with you. Please, please, I'm afraid to be alone." "Were you in a hurry?" The woman spoke intermittently, taking hoarse breaths every now and then. But it was obvious that she needed companionship now. It distracted her a little, prevented her from panicking. "It's nothing." Sarah waved her hand. "No, it's important." The old woman struggled and tried to smile. "I saw in your face that you were in a hurry." "Yes, it's not an interesting story, I'll tell you later. If you promise to get better quickly." "It happens to me. Not for a while, though. My heart hurts." "I need a shot." "Well, they know in the ambulance, and everything will be fine." Just then, a yellow car with a horn honked. 2 uniformed men got out and approached the old woman. Sarah stepped aside, letting the specialists do their work. They asked Susan Smith a few questions and actually gave her an injection. Within moments, the old woman's skin color began to take on a normal hue, and most importantly, her lips went from blue to a normal pink color. Deborah was getting better before her eyes. It was like magic. Doctors are a bit of magicians after all. Sarah thought the ambulance would take the old lady away after such a terrible attack. What's a hospital without a hospital? But the paramedics got into their car and drove off. And Deborah, smiling broadly, approached the surprised Sarah. "Don't you have to go to the hospital?" the girl asked. "What did I forget there?" The injection was given. The attack was relieved. "Now, I will go to the outpatient clinic to my cardiologist. He will choose pills, and I will again live peacefully for several years." "It's a good thing I'm lucky I came across you, baby. Otherwise, I'd be lying here on the asphalt, no people around. Only cars passing by on the road. They don't even look around. It was an accident. I should have been here earlier. I was just late today because of my alarm clock. Now I'm glad I did. By the way, you promised that if I felt better, you'd tell me your interesting story," Deborah reminded me. "Remember, now you're in no hurry." Sarah smiled. "I'm in no hurry now. But there's really nothing interesting about it. Let's check it out." And Sarah told Deborah about her life, even mentioned her childhood, so that the old woman understood the girl has no home. She has nowhere to go. Deborah listened attentively to every word, sometimes sighing sadly, sometimes shaking her head. "Yes, you've had a hard life," she summarized after listening to Sarah's confusing story. She didn't even understand why it had happened. "But you say you suddenly felt better. And then I look at you with such understanding, even regretted, did not say anything. The main thing is working hands and feet. I'll find a new job somehow, don't doubt it. But it's hard for such a young girl in a big city all alone." Without support, Sarah smiled sadly. "It's my fault," Deborah said thoughtfully. "You lost your job because of me, didn't you?" "No way." Sarah shook her hands. "Don't even think about it." "I am thinking about it," she said. "And I've already thought of something." And Deborah suddenly made Sarah a completely unexpected offer. She invited her to live in her apartment. "Until things get better, no problem." "But I'm uncomfortable," Sarah admitted. "Uncomfortable sleeping on the ceiling? The blanket falls down?" Parried the old woman suddenly, and then added seriously, "Honey, you actually saved my life. To give shelter to a kind girl in need of help, how hard can it be? And I myself will have more fun with you. I was all alone and alone." And so Sarah came to live with Deborah. The old woman gave her a whole room of her cozy 2-room apartment, the brightest and most beautiful, with windows overlooking the park. Deborah's offer came in handy, because the very next day after they met, the owner of the apartment asked Sarah to move out. She couldn't pay the rent, and the landlord immediately found new tenants. Sarah was given 24 hours to pack. The girl managed much sooner. She packed her belongings in a single suitcase and went to Deborah's house in the evening of the same day. The lonely old woman was obviously sincerely glad to have a lodger. Deborah behaved with Sarah in such a way that she soon stopped feeling awkward and constrained. Yes, it was an unusual situation, but it was good for everyone. Sarah had a roof over her head. And Deborah? She wasn't lonely anymore. She had someone to talk to watch TV with, to discuss news and recipes, to share her worries and joys. That meant a lot to an elderly person. Sarah, of course, tried to help Deborah in everything, but she herself clearly liked to take care of the girl. The old woman often cooked something tasty for her. She baked pancakes, fried pies on a griddle, made delicious stews of chicken and vegetables. No one had ever tried so hard for Sarah. Sometimes the girl even had tears in her eyes. How pleasant it is, such care. Sarah found a job after all. 3 weeks after the move, she got a job as a sales clerk in a neighboring store. The experience of working in the cash register at this place came in handy. When the girl came home, there was always the smell of something delicious: pies, homemade borscht. Deborah immediately led her to the kitchen, assuring her that a tired girl should definitely eat and rest. Sarah did not object. The girl often felt as if she had known Deborah all her life. She was surprisingly easy to be with, as if it was a normal thing to live with a complete stranger, a stranger in fact. After getting a job, Sarah tried to offer Deborah money to rent a room, but she flatly refused. "Oh, really? Are you like a niece or a granddaughter to me now? There's no way I'm taking money from you, and don't make it up. You'd better save it. Maybe gradually you'll have enough to buy your own place." Over time, Sarah learned Deborah's sad story. The old woman realized why she was alone in her old age. It was really very sad, scary even. Deborah was born in the village to a large family. She was the eldest of 4 sisters. When the girl was 10 years old, her mother died. Her father soon remarried. So into the house came the stepmother, as evil, cold and demanding as in the old fairy tales. She had 2 children, a daughter and a son, the same age as Deborah's younger sisters. This woman immediately disliked Deborah as the oldest and, understandably, a stranger. Her father's wife knew that Deborah saw and noticed everything, and how her stepmother chose the best bits for her children and gave her stepdaughters the leftovers, and how she was always complaining to Papa Gordon about the ill-mannered girls, and how she slowly dragged Deborah's own mother's few pieces of jewelry into her jewelry box. That was particularly hurtful for some reason. Stepmother forced her eldest stepdaughter, Sarah, to work from dawn to dusk, scrubbing floors, cooking, caring for the younger ones, cleaning the livestock. With her arrival in the house for the girl ended childhood. She no longer ran with her friends on the street, did not play with her favorite toys. Talika studied and worked on the household. Instead of gratitude for her help and work, the girl received from her stepmother only reproaches. The bed is not so made, and the borscht is not salty, and the child is unattended, fell off the stool, and hit through her teeth. The woman talked to Sarah, called her a girl, and sometimes even allowed herself to hit the girl, then on the cheek, then on the cheek, then on the head, then on the back. The stepmother was tough to deal with. Sarah was shocked at first. Her mother never laid a finger on any of them, always explained everything with words and here. And then the girl somehow got used to this state of affairs and accepted it. Even if Sarah tried to complain to her father, but he was completely on the side of the stepmother. She had already managed to explain to her husband that this is just a method of education, effective and efficient. "I do not want to raise children lazy, inept. That's what I'm trying to do," she said. And the fact that Sarah grew up as a quiet girl did not exclude fears. That's the 10th thing. The main thing, she knew how to obey and work on the household. As time went on, Sarah grew up, became a teenage girl. She did not do well in school, despite her natural abilities. Earlier, before her mother's death, she was an excellent student. She was especially good at the exact sciences. But now the girl had almost no time for lessons and studies. Sometimes her stepmother wouldn't let her stepdaughter go to school at all. This happened if there were a lot of household chores or needed to look after the younger ones. But met on the girl's way a kind, caring person, school math teacher Gordon. All teachers saw how hard it was for his student. But this man, a frontline soldier and father of 5 children, did not want to stand aside. He had some acquaintances in the city boarding school for gifted children. He begged them to take in an able girl who was in a difficult situation. "When the teacher told me about it, I was happy at first," Deborah recalled. "But then I thought about my stepmother and realized that it wouldn't work. She would never let me leave home. How could I be left without a free maid all of a sudden?" But Gordon talked to Deborah's father, explained what prospects awaited the girl in the city, and he gave the go-ahead. Deborah left home at 15 and never went back. Life at the boarding school was good, In the morning, the children went to classes, after them to the canteen, where a delicious lunch was waiting for them. Then there was free time, during which they could walk, rest, and of course do homework. Deborah was finally able to play, socialize with peers, and quietly do homework. At first, the girl lagged behind the class. The lack of opportunity to learn properly earlier was the influence, but Gordon warned that it will be so. He advised to study especially hard at first, and assured that capable Deborah will quickly catch up with the rest. And so it was. After the new year, the girl became one of the best students in the class. See how much we have in common. Deborah smiled at Sarah. I too had to leave home, literally run away from my cruel stepmother and indifferent father. I too had to learn on my own, to make my own way in this life. Ended childhood. She no longer ran with her friends on the street, did not play with her favorite toys. Talika studied and worked on the household. Instead of gratitude for her help and work, the girl received from her stepmother only reproaches. The bed is not so made, and the borscht is not salty, and the child is unattended. Fell off the stool and hit through her teeth. The woman talked to Sarah, called her a girl, and sometimes even allowed herself to hit the girl, then on the cheek, then on the cheek, then on the head, then on the back. The stepmother was tough to deal with. Sarah was shocked at first. Her mother never laid a finger on any of them, always explained everything with words, and here. And then the girl somehow got used to this state of affairs and accepted it. Even if Sarah tried to complain to her father, but he was completely on the side of the stepmother. She had already managed to explain to her husband that this is just a method of education, effective and efficient. I do not want to raise children lazy, inept. That's what I'm trying to do, she said. And the fact that Sarah grew up as a quiet girl did not exclude fears. That's the 10th thing. The main thing, she knew how to obey and work on the household. As time went on, Sarah grew up, became a teenage girl. She did not do well in school, despite her natural abilities. Earlier, before her mother's death, she was an excellent student. She was especially good at the exact sciences. But now the girl had almost no time for lessons and studies. Sometimes her stepmother wouldn't let her stepdaughter go to school at all. This happened if there were a lot of household chores, or needed to look after the younger ones. But met on the girl's way a kind, caring person, school math teacher Gordon. All teachers saw how hard it was for his student. But this man, a frontline soldier and father of 5 children, did not want to stand aside. He had some acquaintances in the city boarding school for gifted children. He begged them to take an enabled girl who was in a difficult situation. When the teacher told me about it, I was happy at first, Deborah recalled, but then I thought about my stepmother and realized that it wouldn't work. She would never let me leave home. How could I be left without a free maid all of a sudden? But Gordon talked to Deborah's father, explained what prospects awaited the girl in the city, and he gave the go-ahead. Deborah left home at 15 and never went back. Life at the boarding school was good. In the morning, the children went to classes, after them to the canteen, where a delicious lunch was waiting for them. Then there was free time, during which they could walk, rest, and of course do homework. Deborah was finally able to play, socialize with peers, and quietly do homework. At first, the girl lagged behind the class. The lack of opportunity to learn properly earlier was the influence, but Gordon warned that it will be so. He advised to study especially hard at first, and assured that capable Deborah will quickly catch up with the rest. And so it was. After the new year, the girl became one of the best students in the class. See how much we have in common. Deborah smiled at Sarah. I too had to leave home, literally run away from my cruel stepmother and indifferent father. I too had to learn on my own, to make my own way in this life. After boarding school, Deborah easily entered the university. She was given a dormitory. The fragile, beautiful girl chose the profession of an engineer. She graduated from the institute with honors. She got a job in a design bureau, from which she immediately received a small apartment as a young, promising employee. It was easier back then, with housing for young professionals. Deborah sighed. Is it more difficult for you now? So the girl stayed in the city. Now she was a real engineer. At work, Deborah was respected for her hard work, keen mind, and willingness to help others. After a few years, she became head of the department. I thought I was going to live like this for the rest of my life, Deborah said. I decided to devote myself to my work. I liked that kind of life without children in the family. I didn't want that at the time. I studied very hard as a child. I thought I had done my fair share. Only fate had it differently. Deborah often flew to New York for work. This time she was sent for training. The woman loved such business trips. They perfectly diluted gray everyday life, gave new emotions and impressions. After the seminar, Deborah decided to walk around the city. She liked these wide, crowded streets, so spacious, so lively, not at all like their small, quiet town. Deborah walked slowly along the river embankment, looking at the boats and pleasure boats with dressed-up tourists. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, painting everything around her an incredible yellow-pink color. It was at that moment that Chris approached her. A young, tall man with a charming smile and warm gaze immediately introduced himself. He apologized and showered Deborah with compliments, calling her a mysterious beauty, a queen, a beautiful stranger. Of course, by the time she was 45, Deborah had been in relationships, and in more than one. And she'd learned to take compliments. But then something suddenly fluttered inside. Chris, seeing it, became enthusiastic, glowing. Deborah was pleased to realize that her presence alone made this man so happy. They took a long walk. That evening, Chris turned out to be talkative. And it was very useful, because in the conversation there were no awkward pauses and hiccups. He amused Deborah, making her laugh at his jokes. After a couple of hours, it seemed to her that she had known this man all her life. She did not want to part with him at all. That's why Deborah didn't come back to the room alone. The concierge looked at us like that. Deborah smiled. What was the big deal? We were both adults. Who cares? The next morning, Deborah found Chris in the room, as well as her wallet with money, gold jewelry, and even a few almost new dresses. Everything fell into place. Chris had just grasped her trust, said a lot of things, waited until the new acquaintance relaxed, and was so. Deborah did not report him. It would look too unattractive in this story. She met a man on the street, brought him to her room, and he turned out to be a common criminal. Reputation would be seriously damaged. You see, that's a coincidence. Deborah smiled at Susan. Both you and I were fooled by a man. It happens. Only mine not only took my valuables, but left something behind without even realizing it. A month after the ugly story, Deborah realized she was expecting a baby. There was no doubt about who the father was, the same Chris from New York. Deborah didn't know what to do. On the one hand, the child she could pull and alone would be no worse than a married woman. Her apartment was spacious and comfortable. The salary of the head of the engineering department allowed to provide even more than one baby. On the other hand, age. At that time, to give birth at 45 to the first child was considered catastrophically late, although now it does not surprise anyone. And what would people say? Deborah still had strong provincial prejudices about living with an eye on neighbors and acquaintances. And yet the woman made up her mind, realized that this was her last chance to become a mother. She might never get another chance. She had once decided for herself that she would live without children. But realizing that a new life was born under her heart, suddenly desperately wanted to keep this baby. And that's how Deborah got Bill. This guy grew up to be amazing, attractive, charming, smart. Bill had many talents. He drew beautifully, started reading early. He definitely had a knack for math. Even from an early age, the boy was fond of sports, tried many things: soccer, basketball, karate, skiing, hockey. Deborah supported all of her son's hobbies. Bill was a joy to her. She had never imagined that it was possible to love someone so much. The boy reciprocated his mother. He helped around the house, made surprises and gifts just like that, without a reason. Time flew by very quickly. Deborah went on a well-deserved vacation. Bill grew up and went to study, as his mother once did, for an engineer. At the university, he started hiking. The department had a section for students. Wherever they went, they rafted on the river, went to the forest for a week, and went down into the caves. On that fateful day, a group of students went into the mountains. Deborah's heart had been troubled for days before the hike. There was no doubt in her mind that Bill was an excellent climber. Her son is agile, trained from childhood, smart, will not make mistakes. But not everything depends on people. There are unforeseen circumstances. The mountains were a 3-hour drive from the city. The students were going to conquer a particularly difficult peak. The day before, Bill had excitedly told his mother how he had long dreamed of climbing the peak. In the afternoon, Deborah somehow got wound up. A friend came over. Then they went shopping together. Distracted, Deborah even stopped worrying. That evening, that phone call rang. Deborah, looking at the phone, froze. For some reason, she didn't want to pick up the phone. Something told her she was about to get some bad news, and so it was. A group of students had been caught in a mudslide down the mountain. Several people were killed, many injured. 2 boys, including Deborah's son, went missing. And endless hard days dragged on for the 2 elderly mothers. Rescuers spent a long time removing the rubble. Among the rocks and dirt, they found the body of one of the missing boys. Bill, the other one, was never found. You realize there's no chance the man in uniform explained to Deborah. If he was alive, he would have made himself known by now. He stayed under the rubble. It's physically impossible to make out everything. Bill was recognized dead, but for 3 years Deborah could not accept this state of affairs. She never saw the body, so she could not believe what had happened. So Deborah lived with a faint hope for a miracle. The old woman showed Sarah pictures of her son. From them smiled an attractive young man, tall, athletic, with blue eyes. Even from these pictures, it was clear how energetic and cheerful he was. It's hard even for me to believe that such a man no longer exists. Deborah sighed as she looked at the photos. She smiled too, and she often said, "Maybe we'll see him again." "My intuition tells me he's alive," the woman shook her head. "Perhaps I just want to believe it, and yet I feel that he is alive out there somewhere." Once a year, on the day of the tragedy, Deborah would visit the place where it had happened. She sat there at the foot of the mountain, admired the scenery, and remembered her Bill. She would leave flowers at the site of the tragedy for those guys who died under the rubble. After hearing this story, Sarah felt even more for Deborah. She felt sorry for the older woman who had never been able to come to terms with her loss. But Deborah's resilience, her belief that Bill was alive, both admired and caused a pang of sadness in her heart. A year and a half passed imperceptibly. Sarah lived with Deborah and worked as a saleswoman, but she wanted more. Did she study accounting for nothing? So Sarah was always looking for a job in her specialty. And one day luck smiled on her. The girl got a call and was invited to an interview at the factory. An accountant was required. Sarah went to the meeting in a calm mood. Sarah had already been to so many interviews that she could write a book for beginners. If she didn't get the job, it was okay. She had a job, a roof over her head. Not like a year and a half ago, when she suddenly found herself in a desperate situation. She's fine now. But they hired her and told her right away that she was a good fit. They didn't even say, "We'll get back to you." Sarah gasped at first with a rush of emotion. Had her long-held dream come true? Would she really work in her profession in such a big factory and get a good salary? She couldn't wait to share the news with Deborah. Sarah was also given a dormitory at the factory. The building itself was far out of town. "Every day you drive back and forth, you get tired," Deborah said. Most of the employees lived in a cottage community nearby. The rest occupied rooms in a comfortable dormitory on the adjoining property. Deborah was happy for the girl. But the news that Sarah would have to move saddened the old woman. "I'm so used to you. I'm going to miss you," she admitted. "But I'm happy for you. It's a dream come true. I will come to visit you often," she promised. She understood that she would also miss this cozy apartment and kind landlady. Deborah saved her, offered help in a critical situation, became a really close person for Sarah. The girl will never forget her. A new stage of life began. At work, she had to get into everything anew. She had forgotten a lot of things during her work as a salesman. Sarah made a lot of new acquaintances. Everything was so exciting, so wonderful, so new that the girl could not keep her promise to visit Deborah every weekend. She understood everything and did not take offense. But Sarah made sure to call the old lady every evening, asking about her affairs and sharing the news. Deborah always listened attentively, praised and supported her. Sarah felt strong after these conversations. One day the old lady called Sarah herself. It happened on New Year's Eve, when the town was preparing for the holiday. The girl tensed up a little. She usually called Deborah herself. Suddenly she was the first one to call. Was something wrong? She realized that nothing was wrong as soon as she heard the familiar voice. The always calm Deborah could barely contain her emotions. "Bill has been found." The old woman almost shouted into the phone. "He's here. He's alive." Sarah could not believe what she heard. Unlike Deborah, she shared the opinion of the rescuers and the police that the boy had not survived. "He came home this morning, opened his own key. Can you believe he hasn't lost it in over 4 years? It's a miracle." Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. It's incredible, she exclaimed. Yes, it is. As a physicist and a mathematician, I have to admit that there are miracles after all, said Deborah. After all, the chances of salvation for Bill were minimal. What now? Asked a worried Sarah. What's it going to be like now? Well, Bill has so much to do now. He's been declared dead. There's a lot of paperwork to get him back on paper. He's dealing with it. What about me? Sarah asked. I don't want to get in his way. A man needs to rest, get used to everything. You don't know my Bill, Deborah grinned. He's always happy to have visitors. We've had a bunch of his friends at our house since he was a kid. Bill never knew how to relax. Sarah could hardly wait for the weekend. She wanted to see Deborah's son sooner and learn his amazing story. Where was this man for so many years? Why did not give any information about himself? But the girl was worried before the trip, too. Sarah was worried about how this Bill would take her. The girl who had occupied his room for a whole year and a half while he himself had been missing somewhere, perhaps enduring hardship. Deborah opened the door for Sarah. It was as if she had grown younger these days. Her eyes shone with happiness. Hello, come in. Deborah hugged Sarah tightly. The girl gingerly entered the hallway. From the kitchen came voices and laughter. It was Bill's comrades who had come. One of them was with him in the mountains during the mudslide. He had a long convalescence. But he's all right now. He's alive. Come on, don't be shy. Sarah went into the kitchen. There were people sitting around the table. Deborah's friend, two guys a little older than Sarah. A smiling girl. On the wide windowsill sat Bill himself. The girl recognized him immediately from the photos. He looked at the guest and smiled. Slightly disheveled blonde hair, tanned face with correct features, clear blue eyes, wide smile. You are the Sarah that Mom saved. The boy easily jumped down from the windowsill and came closer. He scrutinized the woman who entered. Sarah was embarrassed under his gaze, but the guy's proximity was unexpectedly pleasant. But saved. That's a big word for it, the girl replied. And you? You are the man who disappeared 4 years ago. And then suddenly found? Yes, I am. Bill grinned. That's quite a story. You could make a movie. The evening passed quickly. The company was good and warm. Sarah was welcomed. She didn't feel like a stranger, though she saw everyone here, except Deborah and her friend, for the first time. For the first time, Bill told his story to the crowd. Apparently, he had to explain what had happened to him not for the first time, and remembering the past was not very pleasant. But the people close to him wanted to know the story, and the guy told it over and over again. Bill was one of the first in the group to realize that something terrible and inevitable was happening. First, he heard a growing rumble. Then he saw a dark mass coming at them from the top of the mountain. There was nowhere to hide. There was no escape. Their group was just coming up the steep climb. It wasn't hard to run all the way up there. Bill had time to look down. He saw the multicolored bright helmets of his classmates, who had no clue about anything yet. Somewhere far below, a river was winding in the sun. The next instant, Bill was hit by a heavy wave of mud. The boy felt himself being carried downward at a terrifying speed, and then he lost consciousness. Bill woke up in the hospital. He was covered in abrasions and deep cuts. His legs, his arms were broken, his head was shattered. The doctor promised the boy would live. Then he asked him his name. Bill opened his mouth to answer, but suddenly realized he didn't know his own name. He couldn't answer any of the questions. He couldn't remember where he came from or what had happened to him. Had no idea who his parents were. Didn't know anything about himself at all. Everything from before the hospital was strangely erased from his memory. It's amnesia. It happens, the doctor explained. After a brain injury, the memory is bound to come back. But time passed, and the boy still could not remember anything about himself. It frightened him, made him afraid for the future, and for the past too. Who was he suddenly in that life, of which there were no memories? Had he done something terrible, or had something terrible happen to his family and friends? Why did his brain shut off his memory? There's a reason. The guy was in the hospital for months. All this time, doctors and police tried to find his relatives, gave ads in newspapers, sent out an orientation. There was even a story about him on the local news. But no one ever responded. No one is looking for you, it seems, sighed the head doctor. looking at the unusual patient. "Are you really such a lonely person in your young years?" The boy was silent. He had nothing to answer the doctor. He himself would have given a lot to know the truth about himself. One of the nurses gave the patient a temporary name, Arthur. He reminded her very much of her nephew, whose name was Arthur. The boy agreed. Arthur, so Arthur, what difference does it make? But he felt he really had some other name, and hoped that someday he would be remembered after all. When Bill got a little stronger, the doctor advised him to take a walk around town. He assured him that if he saw something familiar, it could be a trigger for the return of his memory. The boy obediently wandered through the crowded, wide streets and greedily looked around. But nothing the local houses, squares, and parks evoked any response. They seemed utterly alien and unfamiliar. And then it was time for Bill to be discharged from the hospital, because he had already made a full recovery. He couldn't be kept in the hospital any longer. "So where am I supposed to go?" The boy asked the doctor. "A social shelter. You can still get a job. People live there for up to 6 months. Then we'll see. Maybe someone will turn up. Just don't give up looking." Bill spent 6 months in a social shelter, worked at the local sawmill, made new friends and comrades. Everyone supported the guy, tried to help him find his relatives. They gave announcements and leaflets on the streets, and so people were interviewed. But these measures still had no results. Bill decided to live in the conditions that fate offered him. He got a job as a janitor, and the Housing and Utilities Department gave him a small, cramped room under the stairs. But the guy had enough space. He worked on someone else's documents. He had none of his own. Bill accepted this life. He even started to like it. A free tramp with no past. Still, sometimes Bill would jump up at night in bed from some vague, disturbing dreams. He'd wake up in a sweat and couldn't remember what he'd just dreamed. But he knew it had something to do with the past. There was a small television set in Bill's den. The guy liked to watch the news in the evenings, but sometimes he also watched soap operas. It made it easier to fall asleep. And then one day it happened under the New Year's Eve, the TV screen suddenly went interference. This often happened. The guy began to spin the antenna at random and caught an unfamiliar channel. News of some other city he was about to switch over, but suddenly a statue caught his attention. A journalist was broadcasting something about traffic jams blocking traffic in the city. She was standing near the fountain, and Bill realized that he had seen the statue of a boy with a toy bear in his hands standing in the center of the fountain many times. Immediately, memories began to come, scraps of vivid, realistic scenes. Here he is, 8 years old, running with his friends along the bottom of the fountain around this very boy with the bear. They are collecting coins that they managed to throw here for luck. Passers-by shout and argue, will they have enough for ice cream? He's about 18. Next to him is a woman. She has such a kind, dear face. Mom is Mom. The person who always supported him in everything. How could he forget her? Flashes of memories flashed with dizzying speed. The boy remembered everything: his name, his address, his hobbies, his whole life before the hospital. And the moment of the landslide, too. Then his eyes suddenly went black. Bill realized he was losing consciousness. The thought flashed through his mind, what if I forget again? It didn't. Bill woke up on the cold floor. He sat up, looked around. He remembered everything. The boy knew who he was and where he came from. And now there wasn't a second to wait. I went to the police and told them everything Bill recalled, looking off into the distance. Everyone listened with bated breath. Even Deborah, who already knew the story. They sent a request, then called my mother to identify me, he continued. Of course I recognized him, Deborah interjected. Deep down, I always knew this moment would come. So I wasn't surprised. In fact, I was glad. How did you get so far away from here? How did you get to that town? One of Bill's friends asked. The current must have swept me right into the river. That's what saved me, Bill answered. I was unconscious, but by some miracle I didn't drown. The current carried me many kilometers ahead. Somewhere out there I washed ashore. Local fishermen found me, called the police and an ambulance. That's how it all came together. So they sent out an APB on you in a completely different neighborhood, said the girl thoughtfully. Is that why they didn't find you? Bill nodded. And then suddenly his face lit up with a wide smile, which Sarah had already taken a liking to. Well, why are you sitting so glum? The main thing is that everything ended well. The rest of the evening went wonderfully. Everyone talked, laughed, recalled funny incidents from Bill's past. He told the audience about his former life. According to him, it seemed that the guy had had an easy and pleasant life even then. But Sarah realized that it was certainly not easy. Bill is an easygoing, cheerful person. Such people never complain and do not portray themselves as victims, but find the bright side in everything. Sarah suddenly realized that she was trying to catch Bill's gaze. When their eyes met, it was like a warm wave washed over her. She liked everything about this man, his appearance, his demeanor, and his voice. Sarah tried to keep her eyes on the handsome guy, but she couldn't help it. She could only hope that it was not noticeable to the others, who fortunately were very much engaged in the conversation. As darkness fell, it was time to leave. Bill suddenly volunteered to walk Sarah to a cab. Deborah had given her some goodies, pies, pancakes, even pilaf in a casserole dish. She always did that, thinking that Sarah didn't eat anything alone. That's why she was so thin. "It's a magically beautiful evening," Bill remarked when he and Sarah were on the porch. The girl agreed with him. The moon, which had come out from behind the clouds, turned the snowdrifts into frozen sculptures that had come down the hill. Yes, Sarah nodded and added, "It's warm. It's nice. I don't even want to go home." "Maybe you don't have to." Bill squinted slyly. "I suggest we take a walk in the park. See how beautifully it's always decorated for New Year's Eve. I haven't seen it in a long time. I'd like to see it. Are you in?" "I'm in." "I'm in," Sarah answered. A quiet joy rose in her heart. She was so reluctant to leave Bill, and now he offered to continue the evening. The guy confidently took the girl by the hand and led her towards the park. He cheerfully told about his memories connected with this place. But Sarah almost did not listen. Her ears were pounding. Her heart was racing. Her cheeks burned like flames. She marveled at the effect this man had on her. This had never happened to her before. Bill looked risky, free, and natural. He walked as if nothing had happened, held Sarah's hand, and seemed to notice nothing special. He continued to tell her something, pointing one way or the other. Sarah wanted this moment to last forever, her palm in his, him by her side. But Bill was spotted by some guys she knew. They came up to him, barraged him with questions. He let go of Sarah's hand to say hello to his buddies. And then a girl appeared out of nowhere, a very pretty girl, tall, slender, with long blonde hair poking out from under a hat. She threw herself around Bill's neck. He picked her up easily, whirled her around. The girl suddenly kissed him right in front of everyone. Bill looked at her with joyful admiration and did not let go. "I guess I'll be going," said Sarah. The magic of the evening was irretrievably lost because of that beauty in the soft blue coat. So graceful and perfect, like a goddess. And Bill's looking at her. There's something between them. Maybe she was his girlfriend before all this happened to him. Why? Bill looked at her with surprise and regret. Sarah was very excited that night, Bill said. "The evening is just beginning. I'll introduce you to everyone here. You're going to love it." Sarah got ready and started to call a cab since she had to be early for work tomorrow. Her friends walked Sarah to the car. Bill was holding the hand of a beautiful girl in a blue coat named Emma. Sarah realized that she and Bill had once gone to school together, at home. Sarah took a warm bath to calm down. But it didn't help. She still couldn't find her place, pacing from corner to corner, remembering the episodes of that amazing and so long evening. She tried to make sense of her feelings for Bill. He had clearly caught her eye at first sight. Was it really love? After the sad story with Ben, Sarah had tried to avoid even a hint of romance. She'd gotten burned too badly back then. And then she remembered the episode with Emma. She couldn't stop thinking about it. And when Bill took Emma's hand, Sarah's eyes swam. The situation with Emma had caused Sarah unexpected pain. She was still reeling, imagining Bill and Emma together and speculating, trying to figure out who they were to each other. Obviously there was, or had been, something between them before. Or will there be in the future? Sarah didn't sleep a wink until almost morning and then made the decision not to think about Bill anymore, not to dream about him, not to make plans. He was no match for her. So smart and handsome and manly. Not everyone could handle what this guy had to endure. Who is she? No, Bill's more suited to a girl like Emma. That's something we have to accept. Deborah and Sarah decided not to go to her place for the time being. She was afraid of meeting Bill. She missed the old lady and often called her, but refused invitations to come over, citing busyness. And so it was in fact at work, hot time, reports, inspections. No time to visit. Deborah sometimes said something about Bill while talking to Sarah on the phone. The guy was back at university and decided to finish his studies by correspondence, because he got a job and started his own business at the same time. He lost so much time, and now he's trying to make up for it, Deborah shared with Sarah. Her voice was clearly proud of her son. He was always so active, and now he's just not at all. I hardly ever see him at home. He's out and about. That's good. That's great. I still can't believe I finally found my son. If you can't come to me, I'll come visit you. I miss you tonight. I'll bring you some pies because I know you. You probably don't eat anything there. Sarah always enjoyed Deborah's visits. She was used to sharing all her worries and joys with her. But now she couldn't tell her loved one about the most important thing, because Deborah was Bill's mother. And yet Sarah met with the guy a few more times. He'd pick up her mother when she stayed late at Sarah's house. He'd come into the room with a smile on his face, and it would become cheerful. The house was filled with a special energy, which Sarah felt almost physically. Bill joked with Sarah, asked her a couple of non-committal phrases. He was good at keeping a casual conversation going. He was interested in the girl's affairs and occasionally said something about himself. Sarah tried desperately to glean from his stories and Deborah's words whether Bill was seeing Emma, but it was impossible to understand. On a lovely May evening, Sarah was coming home from work. She felt light and peaceful. The sight of nature awakening always had a calming effect on the girl. Besides, tomorrow was a day off, and all the reports were already turned in. She could relax and unwind. At the entrance of the dormitory, Sarah noticed Bill's car. Her heart raced, as it always did when she met this man. The guy had already seen her and got out of the car. He stood with his elbows resting on the bumpers, smiling as always. Strange, why was he here? "Hi," said Bill. He pulled up alongside him. "Girl, hello. I don't have Deborah. Is something wrong?" "I'm not here to see her." "Who was it for?" "You, of course." What did Sarah feel? Electric pulses running through her body. He said, "To you, meaning her, Sarah, me?" Automatically, the girl asked again. Yes, Bill's smile grew even wider and warmer, or something. "You have such a surprised look on your face, as if some star had come to see me, not me." "Well, it's not every day you come to see me either," Sarah smiled back. She tried her best not to show her joy at seeing her boyfriend. He had come to see her, the two of them alone, with no one else around. "Decided it was time to have a serious talk," Bill said suddenly. He'd been meaning to for a long time. "Do you have time?" Does she have time for Bill? She always does. Sarah nodded affirmatively. "Good. Then get in. I'll take you to a very nice place." The girl gladly settled into the front passenger seat. Bill drove her through the evening city and, as always, told her something and joked. Sarah felt really happy at this moment. He's there for her. They are going somewhere, it doesn't matter where. And most importantly, there is a warmth and sympathy coming from Bill. He looks at her in that special way. Sarah's heart occasionally sank with a sweet premonition, but she forbade herself to hope there was no telling what Bill wanted to talk to her about. Could it have anything to do with Deborah? And here she was, daydreaming. Bill drove the car down the suburban highway. On both sides of the road were fields, crops, bushes, and hills. It all looked fantastic in the setting sun. Sarah enjoyed the view and didn't ask any questions. She was having a great time as it was. Finally, Bill parked the car on the curb, got out of the salon, gallantly opened the door in front of Sarah, and extended his hand to her. The scents of stepped grasses warmed by the sun during the day fell on the girl. "Let's climb that hill," Bill said, pointing with his hand. They climbed the hill, and Sarah's mind was swarming with questions. But she realized that Bill would explain everything himself. She didn't want to disturb the silence with her irrepressible curiosity. Soon they were at the top. "I wanted to show you this beauty," the boy said. "Look around." Sarah was breathtakingly surprised by the view. The city was visible from the hill, the blue of the distance in a light haze. Beautiful, big, unfamiliar from this angle. It was beautiful and breathtaking. "Knew you'd appreciate it," Bill said with a smile, looking at the girl. "Thank you. It really is an incredible sight. If we wait until dark, it'll be even more beautiful. The lights will come on, It's beyond description. I often come here to reflect, to relax, but to be alone. This is my place. Now it's yours too. Sarah realized that Bill was about to say something important. He looked determined. Sarah, I want to be as honest and straightforward with you as possible, he began. So you should know that I've been thinking about you ever since we first met. This confession made the girl dizzy and gave her goosebumps. What happened to me, that story, taught me how to be a good judge of character, Bill went on. I saw at once what a wonderful person you are. Trustworthy, kind, and sincere. Not just a beautiful girl, but special. Unique. There's no one else like you. And I would very much like to be near you, to protect you, to help you in this life, to see every day your wonderful eyes and kind smile. If you're such a good judge of people, Sarah finally pulled herself together and looked directly into her companion's eyes. Then you must have noticed how I feel about you. I can feel it, Bill agreed. But I need to be sure, and that's why I'm having this conversation. I'm glad you decided to do it, Sarah smiled. Bill understood. He came closer and put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. They stood like that for a long, long time, smiling, silent, alone in the whole world, and looked at the city, which gradually decorated itself with bright running lights. It can't be. I robbed her of her money, the ex-husband froze when he saw his rich wife on TV. In one of Jersey City's parks, children were frolicking, couples were strolling, and young mothers with strollers were relaxing after household chores. Christopher stood by a small fountain, holding a single rose. His hands were trembling with excitement. The young, handsome 20-year-old was waiting for his girlfriend Allison, who was already 20 minutes late. She can't not show up, the young man thought to himself. Christopher had been dating Allison for a couple months now, and he'd never had her late or ignore a meeting. Finally, he saw her thin silhouette in the distance. She wasn't walking, she was floating down the road. Her gait was so graceful and airy. Christopher was tired of waiting for the time to come. He walked towards her, and as soon as the girl approached, Christopher noticed that the expression on her face was sad. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I knew you had some kind of misfortune." Christopher was worried and hugged his favorite girl. Allison didn't hug him back and didn't take the flower. The girl, embarrassed, didn't want to tell the reason for her sadness. Christopher looked her straight in the eyes and asked her to keep quiet. "I'm beginning to worry," he said. "Is your grief so great that you can't even share it with me?" "My grief is you," Allison said, and looked up at Christopher. He tensed. He hadn't done her any harm, hadn't hurt her in any way. He was generally trying to do his best to make Allison happy. He asked for clarification on exactly how he could have spoiled his beloved's mood. "You're very nice, but I'm tired of walking in parks and sitting on benches," Allison said. "You've never once invited me to a restaurant, never given me anything but these roses. You realize I need a man around me, not a boy. There's no hope for you. I can't see you as my rock." "You can just say you don't want to have a relationship with a poor man," Christopher said. The boy was insulted, humiliated, and angry. Because of this, he himself was well aware that he had no money. Christopher couldn't give Allison an expensive gift, invite her even to a movie. That would undoubtedly do a lot of damage to his wallet. "How can I have money if I'm only 20? Christopher didn't understand. "We still have a long way to go. You and I are going to grow and develop together." Allison waved her head. "I don't want to wait, I don't want to grow. And I don't want to drag anyone forward," she replied. "I want a grown-up, established man." Christopher didn't seem like the kind of man who could ever accomplish anything. Her words cut him to the core. 10 years had passed since then, and he still hadn't forgotten Allison's words. He never met that girl again. How she turned out, he didn't know. But Christopher had learned that all women were only after money, and no one was interested in sincere feelings. Allison gave him a prejudice against all girls at once. Christopher could not build a serious relationship and did not even try to get close to anyone for quite a long time. By the way, there was some truth in Allison's statement. Christopher really did not aspire to a lot of money. He had misunderstood the girl. She wasn't saying that the guy was indigent and couldn't do anything in this life. She just wanted a different standard of living. She wanted to live a rich life, and Christopher could only give her an average one. She tried to explain this to him, but it was all pointless. Christopher wasn't looking for a big paycheck. He was the kind of man who believed that big money could not be earned by honest labor. So he didn't even try. He always said that rich people were either lucky or crooks. But he never thought he would fall into one of those categories, or maybe both. Christopher was already 30 years old when he met Elizabeth. He was working at a car repair shop, and an expensive car had been brought to him. It was the kind of brand their auto repair shop had never seen before. When Christopher saw the owner of the car, his jaw nearly dropped to the floor. Elizabeth noticed the surprise. She was even pleased. The young businesswoman herself offered Christopher her phone number. She didn't look at the lack of men. She could take care of herself and fulfill her own desires. And Christopher thought for the first time that with a girl like Elizabeth, he could try to build something serious. Elizabeth certainly didn't seem mercantile to him in this situation. Rather, he was becoming a keeper. Of course, the man did not assume that a rich girl could consider him as a potential fiancé. But already after the first date, it was clear that Elizabeth was not looking for a one-night stand. Although she was rich, she did not have the main treasure. She was lonely. But it couldn't be said that Christopher was her last option. No, she did take an interest in the simple car mechanic. And Christopher fell in love with Elizabeth. And not just for the money. 6 months into their relationship, he and Elizabeth were married. One day the man caught himself thinking that he was the lucky man he had thought of with contempt throughout his life. The man himself did not seem to have fully realized what he loved more than Elizabeth herself, or the life she had provided for him. And Elizabeth had spared nothing for the one she loved. Christopher no longer needed to work at the auto shop. He was learning the intricacies of running a business. Elizabeth thought about giving him his own car service for their anniversary. But for now, it was just a thought. In principle, she was happy with everything as it was. She was just worried that her spouse might consider himself uncomfortable with the fact that he lived at his wife's expense. But Christopher didn't feel any inferiority. He was more than happy with everything. Elizabeth and Christopher decided to celebrate the first anniversary of their marriage alone with each other without any lavish festivities. The couple booked a table at a restaurant. Before that, they took a boat ride. It was a day just for the two of them. But their plans were not destined to materialize. Throughout the day, Elizabeth received calls from her assistant, Ben. The young man couldn't get through. First, Elizabeth hung up, and then she turned off the phone so that nothing distracted her from communicating with her husband. Ben wrote messages that went unanswered. Eventually, he found out that his boss was celebrating her anniversary at a restaurant, so she was ignoring his calls. Ben had a lot of reasons to worry, and some pretty serious ones. There was no putting off the conversation. In the middle of the evening, when Elizabeth and Christopher were about to exchange gifts, her assistant burst into the restaurant. The girl still hadn't gotten the papers for the car service she was going to present to her spouse. "Elizabeth Igorevna, we agreed with you that if I call more than 3 times, it means that there is trouble," Ben said, panting. He was obviously running to the boss with all his legs. That was why his breathing was labored. Well, what could have been so serious on Saturday, Elizabeth didn't understand. If it was really urgent, you could have written a message and then called. The assistant replied that it wasn't just urgent, it was an emergency. He offered to step aside and talk, but Elizabeth told him she had no secrets from her husband. "You're due for an inspection on Monday," Ben told her. "And it will be the kind of inspection that will find exactly what it's looking for," he added. "We've been through so many of these inspections already that it's simply impossible to intimidate me with them," Elizabeth replied with a laugh. She always used this particular form of her employee's name when she wanted to show that she considered his words to be a mere trifle. "We've been set up this time," Ben said seriously. "Your partner, with whom, let's face it, we weren't exactly working a clean scheme, has been cooperating with the police and with the IRS. He himself was recently nailed, which is why he wants to pull you out after him." Elizabeth tensed. She was starting to worry now, too. She wanted to hug Ben, to thank him for being able to find her after all. But there was no time for tenderness. She needed to find out what Elizabeth was in danger of being tested, and what she could do to avoid the consequences. "Unfortunately, Elizabeth, it could get you jail time," Ben said without joy at all. "And there is only one way to avoid it." Elizabeth was literally numbed by the words of her assistant. She had never expected that one of her business partners could set her up so seriously. The girl conducted her business honestly, without gray schemes and fraud. And she always trusted her partners. It turns out that it was someone's planned scheme to get her out of the game. Ben said that the person who set it all up agreed to go along with it only if Elizabeth would hand over the business to him. But she'd still have to face an audit from the IRS. How can I get out of this situation? Elizabeth didn't understand. You said there was an option, but I don't see any way out. I can't give my business to someone I don't know. Unfortunately, if you don't sign over all your assets to someone else, you'll be ruined, Ben said. Christopher sat silent the whole time. He didn't understand anything about his wife's affairs. The only thing he could realize was that she was in deep trouble. Elizabeth was crying bitterly, completely confused. Christopher stood next to his beloved and hugged her. The girl clung to his arm. But you can sign everything over to someone you trust, Ben suggested. We'll declare you bankrupt. If you don't have anything, there's nothing to take away. It's better to hand everything over to someone close to you than to an obscure character who just wants to make a profit at your expense. Elizabeth raised her tearful eyes to the assistant, looking at him as if her whole life depended on his words. She was so depressed and frightened that she was unable to think straight. Ben had caught the boss by surprise at a moment when she was as happy and relaxed as possible. The news of the impending setup had stunned her. That's what the man was counting on. At any other moment, the girl would have realized that this was some kind of divorce. But now she didn't see the illogic and inconsistency in his words. You can sign everything over to your parents or to your next of kin, Ben reasoned. Or someone you trust. Maybe someone from the company? You know very well that I have no parents, no brothers, no sisters, Elizabeth answered him. She thought Ben was alluding to himself, but he might not have counted on it because Elizabeth couldn't trust him at that moment. She continued to hold Christopher's hand and suddenly realized, I'll sign the company over to my husband now, she said. That won't arouse suspicion. But the husband is also a close relative, Ben said. Elizabeth looked at Christopher and asked him if he would be willing to take on that responsibility. Ben looked displeased. He was clearly expecting the company to go to him. Christopher didn't answer anything, just froze in one pose, as if he wanted to avoid being noticed. Either I go to prison, Elizabeth said. But if your husband doesn't want to be involved in your affairs, we can think about it, Ben added uncertainly. He agrees, Elizabeth said without looking at the assistant. Well, I guess he does, Christopher said uncertainly. It's like I don't have a choice. I will prepare all the documents and come to your house tomorrow to sign them, Ben said quickly. The assistant congratulated Elizabeth and Christopher on their anniversary, wished them a good evening, and hurried away. At last he looked very intently at Christopher. The man could not decipher the emotion that lurked in his gaze. A calm and happy continuation of the evening was out of the question. Elizabeth didn't bother to give her gift. The next morning Ben came even earlier than Elizabeth and Christopher had time to clean up. The aide had to wait, and at breakfast they sat down together at the table. I thought a lot about what you said last night, Elizabeth said while Ben was preparing the papers. She had indeed thought about what the assistant had told her, but she didn't analyze his words. Didn't try to find a setup. Elizabeth was thinking about exactly how she could avoid the consequences. It seemed to her that simply transferring the company to her husband was not enough. Christopher and I should probably get a divorce, she said. Christopher immediately rose from his seat. Ben darted his eyes at his boss. So what do you think? Do you think the IRS employs fools? Elizabeth reasoned. They won't realize we just redid the paperwork when they smell something fishy. If we're divorced, there'll be fewer questions. Don't worry and don't do anything rash, Ben cautioned Elizabeth. First of all, we'll do it retroactively. Secondly, we need it more for the competitor than for verification. After all, he wants to deal with you specifically, not your case. Liz. I don't like this, said Christopher, who had just been standing there. I'm definitely not getting a divorce. Elizabeth sighed, waving her hand. Give me your papers, she said. Doomedly, she leafed through a couple of documents, but more for the sake of appearances, she didn't even read what was written there. She had no reason not to trust Ben. They'd been working together for years. The documents are signed. The assistant put everything in a folder and promised to straighten everything out. Expect my call with good news, Ben said. Elizabeth thanked him and finally touched her cup of coffee, which had already managed to become cold. By evening, it had come to Elizabeth's attention that she hadn't gotten herself a copy of the paperwork, that the whole thing was kind of weird in general. In short, Elizabeth began to realize that she had made a mistake. She quickly grabbed her phone and texted her assistant to bring or courier her a copy of the contract. "You don't look well at all," said Christopher, who was suddenly at Elizabeth's side. "I suggest you have a glass of your favorite wine and calm down." He took out a bottle and a glass, quickly filled it, and handed it to his wife. Elizabeth took the drink, thanking him. She stared at one point and thought about something of her own. "I think I did the stupidest thing of my life today," she said quietly and took a sip. "You're just nervous, aren't you?" Christopher tried to reassure her. "You've been thinking about it all day, so you've been having strange thoughts. Have some wine, lie down and rest. Today is done, and tomorrow there will be other things to do. New worries, fresh thoughts." Elizabeth asked Christopher to sit down next to her. As soon as he lowered himself onto the couch, the girl laid her head on his shoulder. She was swollen from just one sip, immediately pulled to sleep. "You're right. I'm so tired that I don't know what I'm thinking. My eyes are closing," Elizabeth said. "Don't fight it," Christopher said, stroking her head. "You need to rest. You didn't sleep much the night before. You've been on edge all day today, so take care of yourself." Elizabeth relaxed in the warm embrace of her lover, took a couple more sips, set the glass on the small table near the sofa, then returned her head to her husband's shoulder and gradually slid into his lap. Christopher continued to stroke Elizabeth's hair and tell her that everything would be all right. He was scared himself, but he held on for the sake of keeping Elizabeth from worrying even more. Someone had to keep a cool head. Elizabeth hadn't opened her eyes yet, but she already realized something was wrong. Her head ached as if she had emptied several bottles of wine last night instead of just a few sips. She didn't want to open her eyes, so Elizabeth decided to sleep a little longer. She rolled over onto her other side and froze. She realized she wasn't in her own bed because she felt a huge, hard pillow under her head. It was like the one her grandmother had in the village. Elizabeth had always thought it weighed 50 pounds and could kill someone if she wanted to. In her house, there were no such pillows in any bedroom. No sofa could have such a thing. Her cheek was stabbed and feathery. And that feeling, too, was from a distant childhood. Elizabeth remembered perfectly well how unpleasant it was to show the sharp tips of feathers through pillowcases, and she would pull them out of the fabric and examine them. And Granny would scold every time she found a pile of those feathers and fluff under the bed. Elizabeth still risked opening her eyes. She couldn't lie there forever and avoid reality. The room was dusky, but there was a glimpse of sunlight through the thick curtains, indicating that the time had definitely passed the afternoon. The girl did not realize where she was. She couldn't see the room, only a thin line of light from the window, which showed dust particles flying around the room. Elizabeth got out of bed, sliding the curtains open. Outside the window, she saw a wooden fence and a lot of bushes of some kind. It felt like she was at a country house or in a village. She even thought she heard cows mooing somewhere in the distance. Elizabeth slowly turned around in the room and guessed from the furnishings that she had actually found herself in an incomprehensible way in a poor village cottage. The room contained the bed from which the girl had risen a few minutes ago, a stove, a table with a white tablecloth, and a closet. Elizabeth did not understand anything. Never before had she been in this place. How had she ended up here in the first place? The last thing Elizabeth remembered from last night was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine and her husband Christopher beside her. There was no way she could have drunk so much to completely forget everything. Elizabeth didn't have her ID or phone with her. She stayed in the homemade clothes she had been wearing yesterday. How she had gotten to this place was unclear, but one thing was clear: she had to go home. Elizabeth walked towards the exit. When she left the room, she found herself in the kitchen, which was also a hallway. Near the door, she noticed her suitcase, immediately opened it. Inside were several things that someone had hastily left. They were not folded, they were lying in a heap. In a separate pocket lay a passport and a few other documents. Very interesting, Elizabeth stretched out. Did I run away from home or something? Apparently something happened yesterday that made me run away from home. but I couldn't reconstruct the events of the previous day at all. All I remembered was the evening by the fireplace, my head on Christopher's shoulder, and the glass in front of me. I only took a couple sips. There was no way that amount of alcohol could have caused my memory loss. Elizabeth rummaged through more of her suitcase, hoping to find a cell phone there. But there was nothing there. Without that gadget, the girl certainly wouldn't run. She couldn't imagine her life without a smartphone at all. Elizabeth stepped outside. The sunlight hurt her eyes, which were used to semi-darkness. The girl put her palm to her forehead to cover herself a little from the sun and looked around. There were several other huts nearby, as poor and dilapidated as the one in which she had awakened. Some of the huts were definitely abandoned, but the closest one was clearly inhabited. And suddenly Elizabeth noticed an old woman sitting on a bench in the yard of a neighboring house. The girl decided that she could help her. In fact, Elizabeth was very happy when she saw someone alive in the middle of nowhere. She immediately ran up to her neighbor. As she got closer, Elizabeth discovered that the neighbor was not the infirm old woman she had thought she was at first sight. It was just that she was dressed in a very rustic way that gave age. "How do you do?" Elizabeth said. "I apologize for disturbing you, but could you tell me where I am and how I came to be here?" The neighbor looked at her carefully. The woman's eyes were so pale, as if transparent. She seemed to know something, but she was in no hurry to tell. "My name is Elizabeth," she introduced herself, thinking it would help her to make the old woman feel at ease. "She's alive," after all, the neighbor suddenly said, which completely disconcerted Elizabeth. "I saw them bringing you in yesterday. I thought they were trying to close the crime. I almost called the police. But there's no cell phone service here." Elizabeth asked the woman to tell her what she'd seen, and then remembered to get the stranger's name. "My name is Mary Adams," the neighbor replied. "I suffer from insomnia. I couldn't sleep last night, and then I heard something. It was late at night. A car came to the window. The car was parked in front of the neighbor's house," said Mary. "I thought my old lady was coming back. But no. 2 men got out of the car, carried you in their arms, carried you into the house, and drove away." Elizabeth, barely able to stay on her feet, asked Mary to describe the men. "I know it was dark, but can you remember anything? Or the make of the car?" Elizabeth asked, folding her arms across her chest in a gesture of pleading. "I could see clearly. They were shining their headlights so bright that half the village could see them," Mary Adams replied, describing the 2 men who had carried Elizabeth into the house. The girl listened to Mary and could not believe her ears, trying to find some excuses and explanations. She hoped the old woman was wrong after all, but there could be no doubt. After the neighbor described the car, Elizabeth was already sure that her husband and her assistant had brought her here. But how was that possible? Elizabeth didn't even know they knew each other. To her mind, the whole thing was just unthinkable. "Did they talk about anything?" she asked. "I can't tell you that now," Mary Adams replied. "I see well for my age, but I don't hear very well. Not even a little," the old woman said guiltily. It was impossible to hear anything. Elizabeth thanked her neighbor once again, went back to her new home. Mary Adams shouted to her that the house was abandoned, so she could stay there as long as she saw fit. "And you can come and see me. I'm the only one living here," she added. "Thanks, but I'm going into town. By the way, can you tell me how to get there?" Elizabeth stopped and asked. The girl stood at the bus stop and borrowed some money from Mary Adams for transportation. She left her things with her too, because she didn't want to carry a suitcase. All she took with her was her passport. She had to walk to her house, which was in the most remote part of the city. Her cottage was located in a place that was considered elite. It was something like a village for the rich. The only way to get there was with a pass, which Elizabeth didn't have with her, of course. But the guard at the gate let her in for old time's sake. What confused her was that he did so reluctantly. "Peter Stephen, have you already forgotten me for one night?" Elizabeth joked. But all she got in response was the guard's embarrassment and a guilty look. "You will go to the house and find out everything there. I'm forbidden to let you in, and I'll probably get a lot for disobeying orders," Peter replied after a long pause. Elizabeth did not understand anything, although she was beginning to guess. Only yesterday she had signed the papers transferring her business to her husband. and today she had been chased out of the house. The only thing she couldn't understand was why she wasn't allowed in the house. It had nothing to do with the company anymore. Elizabeth rang the bell. At the gate, the door was opened by an unfamiliar man. It was the guard. Elizabeth guessed from the uniform. "This is my house. Let me in," she said calmly. "Not true. The mistress is home now." The guard answered her. "This is the first time I've ever seen you." "No wonder, since it's the first day you've worked here." Elizabeth laughed nervously. "Get out of my way. I'm the boss." Just then Elizabeth noticed a young girl behind the guard. She was strolling across the courtyard in an icy silk robe. Elizabeth couldn't stand it. She tried to lunge at the imposter, but the guard grabbed the girl and threw her straight to the ground. "What's going on here?" Elizabeth screamed. "I'm in some parallel universe." The girl, who was strolling through the courtyard, noticed the guest, walked smoothly to the gate, and looked at Elizabeth haughtily. "This is my home now," said the stranger, smiling smugly. "And Christopher is mine at last. And you can go wherever you like, but don't set foot here again." So Elizabeth wasn't crazy. It was all Christopher's doing. That was Elizabeth's suspicion, but she couldn't understand why she didn't own the house either. The only place she could find out the truth was in her office. That's where Elizabeth decided to go. She had to walk again, because she didn't even have money for a cab. She was terrified of being kicked out of her own company, but she had to talk to her husband, no matter what it took. She approached the building where her office was located, noticing that the guards had changed there as well. When only he had time to organize all this, the girl wondered. She had already guessed that she wouldn't be allowed in here now either. But she had to talk to Christopher at any cost. She was lucky she saw that her car, which apparently didn't belong to her anymore either, had pulled into the parking lot. Christopher got out of the car, wearing a nice business suit and a very satisfied look on his face. His face showed that he felt he was the ruler of the world. He's getting into character fast, Elizabeth thought. She ran up to the bridge, jumped on him from behind and started hitting him on the shoulders, on the head, shouting insults, while the passers-by watched with interest. The guards ran out of the building and took Elizabeth off Christopher's back. The girl, mad with anger, waved her hand at them, saying, "It's okay, he'll sort it out." But as soon as the guard let Elizabeth go, she threw herself at her husband again and began to beat him with her palms. She didn't know how to fight, she just swung her arms left and right, not even looking where she was hitting. One of the guards grabbed her by the waist, and Elizabeth continued to flail her arms and legs like a bug that has fallen on its back and can't turn over. "I understand your anger, but don't embarrass yourself," Christopher said. "Why are you driving my car? Is there a girl walking around in my house?" Elizabeth shouted. "I've already realized that you've taken the company away from me, but what does that have to do with the property?" "You should have read the documents you signed more carefully," Christopher said calmly. Elizabeth froze. She was no longer hysterical. She realized that she had signed over everything to him. She had no chance of getting anything back. "Was your mistress in the house?" she asked with a hint of contempt. "How long have you been with her?" "It doesn't matter," Christopher said. "Get out of here before they force you out. You're free to go. The divorce petition has already been filed." Elizabeth was released. She didn't throw herself, she stayed where she was and just watched her traitorous husband go to her office, where he would run her business, live in her house and drive her car. She was so stunned by her spouse's insolence and meanness that she couldn't cry or get angry, nothing. And then she noticed Ben coming out of the office. The former assistant was obviously in a great mood, walking almost at a gallop. Elizabeth rushed over to him. "Why did you do that?" she asked, grabbing Ben by his jacket. He was scared. He hadn't expected to see his former boss. He tried to say something, but he couldn't get a complete sentence out of his mouth out of excitement. He said he didn't know anything, that it was all Christopher's plan. And he wasn't lying about the tests. They were indeed planned. "How could you not know when you brought me documents to sign that said I was giving my husband all my assets? Did you deliberately frame your speeches to confuse me as much as possible? To panic me?" "I really didn't know. They slipped me the wrong papers, Ben continued to lie. You brought me into the house. Elizabeth came by with Christopher. Did the neighbor see you? Stop lying to me. You set this whole thing up together. By the way, why don't I remember anything? Guilt. I was interrupted. Ben lowered his eyes. He realized that there was no point in lying anymore. His complicity in this crime was obvious. And then behind the man's back, some girl screamed. Oh, brother. Elizabeth recognized that voice at once. It was that thin, gentle voice that had told her hours ago that she was no longer welcome in the house. Ben's face showed that he was not happy with the situation. He didn't want his former boss to know his motives for this deception. So that's what this is all about, Elizabeth said when she saw the girl. It's your sister. Have you taken care of the family welfare? Elizabeth, you were told to leave. Go on your way, Ben said when he realized there was no point in hiding anymore. You can't prove anything. If you go to the police, they'll send you straight to forensics. Elizabeth didn't understand. What kind of examination would they send her to? But Ben quickly explained to her that she had blacked out the day before for a reason. The girl had already guessed that something had been spiked in her wine, and the assistant confirmed it. The police have been alerted to your case. Unless you want to end your days in a mental institution or behind bars, you'd better not go to the police, Ben warned her. You've done your homework, Elizabeth said through gritted teeth, clenching her fists. Ben's sister, Sandy, hid behind him because she saw Elizabeth's fighting spirit, but her brother reassured her. Sandy, don't worry. She won't have time to hurt you. The guards are already on standby, he said. Elizabeth decided to take her almost ex-husband's advice and not embarrass herself anymore. She walked Ben and her sister to the door and then kicked her former assistant's car with all her might. Security guards immediately ran out of the office, and Elizabeth rushed out. She stopped when she had run out of strength and there was no pursuit. Elizabeth was literally gasping for breath. She had never run so much and so fast before. If she could escape from the guards, she could not escape from her own thoughts. Elizabeth realized that through her own stupidity and carelessness, she had lost everything she had earned and accumulated through years of hard work. Elizabeth sobbed. She sat upright on the ground, leaning her back against some unremarkable stall. "Girl, are you scaring my customers like this?" said the indignant stall clerk, who had been listening to Elizabeth crying and mumbling to herself for a long time. But when the woman saw Elizabeth, her mood changed. She realized that the poor girl was in trouble. She could tell by the crying. But Elizabeth looked decent, so she was trustworthy. The woman even asked if Elizabeth needed any help. "If it is not difficult to borrow $3 from me for a ticket to the village," said the girl. "I'm asking for a loan. When I have the money, I will definitely pay you back." "Take one," said the woman and handed Elizabeth a bill. "We'll pay it back, or we won't. That's another matter. At least you can buy yourself something to eat." Elizabeth was also ashamed to accept the handout, but she was in no position to refuse it. She promised herself that she would be sure to pay back Mary Adams, who had given her money for her journey from the village. With that saleswoman, she was sure she would find a way out of the hole she had fallen into through her own gullibility and foolishness. Elizabeth returned to the village. She didn't know where else to go. She had no place in the city in which to find shelter, and here some of her belongings remained, and at least one acquaintance who was willing to take in and help was sweet old Mary Adams. "Yes, the boys are very brazen these days," Mrs. Adams said, listening to Elizabeth's story of how she came to be in this village. The girl had bought the cheapest waffles and cake for her neighbor to thank her for her help. They sat in the kitchen drinking tea. Mary Adams was thinking about how she could help the unfortunate girl, and Elizabeth was thinking about how she could get out of her plight. Though she was engaged in business, she had failed to make any useful connections. The girl did not participate in dubious schemes, did not give bribes, so she could not agree with anyone. The partners did not care who ran her company, she herself or her ex-husband. Mary offered Elizabeth to stay the night at her house, but Elizabeth declined. She felt that she had already squeezed the woman too much. There was no light in the house Christopher and Ben had put her in, but Elizabeth didn't need it. She lit a candle she'd also borrowed from a neighbor. It was enough. It seemed to Elizabeth that she would not be able to sleep and would think about her problems all night. but her strength left her, and she fell asleep as soon as she put her head on the pillow. In the morning, Elizabeth decided to make some improvements to her new home. There was no telling how long she would have to spend here. She wanted to create some semblance of comfort. For the first time, she noticed the decoration of the room. The house seemed to have been abandoned not too long ago. Dust had already accumulated on the shelves, but it didn't look like it had been there for years. In the kitchen drawers, there were still packets of pasta, cereal with expiration dates that hadn't expired. The first thing Elizabeth did was dust. She decided to find a rag and suddenly noticed a note in the most prominent place in front of the front door. She assumed it was a message from her ex-husband to her. With trembling hands, she took the note, began to read it, and from the very first line she realized that the letter was not meant for her. It began with the words, "My dear daughter." Her mother had died a long time ago. She couldn't have left a note for her. But Elizabeth didn't stop reading. The letter was from the woman who owned the house to her daughter. She apologized to her, hoping that her daughter might remember her one day, maybe decide to visit. But the former owner of the house had moved away. She gave her daughter an address where she could find her, begged her to come visit her mother. Elizabeth wiped away the tear that rolled down her cheek after reading the message. So much maternal love and pain in those words written in pencil with a trembling hand. The girl wondered what had happened between mother and daughter that they had to separate and cut off contact for several years. Elizabeth could learn the truth from only one person, so she went to him. "I've been waiting for you," Mary Adams exclaimed joyfully when she saw Elizabeth on the doorstep. "I wanted to come to you to ask you to breakfast." The woman didn't seem to be lying. Her table was indeed already set. Fragrant tea, luscious cakes, pancakes, and cottage cheese. Mary Adams must have gotten up very early to prepare a treat for her new acquaintance. Elizabeth even blushed with embarrassment. "Why do you trouble yourself so much?" Elizabeth was modest. "I'm so embarrassed that I barged into your life." "I'm only glad you did," Mary Adams replied animatedly. "I'm all alone with no grandchildren or children. My neighbor left me. It's good to have you here. I feel sorry for you, though. It's not good for you at all." Mary, a little embarrassed by the last sentence, remembered how Elizabeth had cried the day before and worried that she had lost everything she had. But Elizabeth was not offended. On the contrary, she even smiled. "By the way, I wanted to ask you about your previous neighbor." Elizabeth remembered, sitting down at the table, and the dishes gave off such an appetizing aroma that she wanted to start breakfast as soon as possible. Lucy lived in that house. Immediately the memories rushed back to her mind. Mary Adams was a good womankind. She hadn't been gone that long, not even a year. Lucy and her daughter were unlucky. Did they fight a lot? A lot. "That's interesting to me," Elizabeth said and put the note on the table. Mary put on her glasses, picked up the letter, ran her eyes over it quickly. After reading it, she put her glasses back on the table and looked out the window. She seemed to have tears in her eyes as well. Because of such foolishness, frankly, they feared, Mary said after a long pause. Elizabeth had already managed to whip up a couple of pancakes in the meantime. Catherine is Lucy's daughter. She found a young man in town who wasn't young at all and was about 15 years older, probably. But rich. Lucy did not accept such a son-in-law. They called her daughter all sorts of names. But she and her fiancé come to visit together. That was the last time Catherine visited her mother, and she told her not to show her face here. Elizabeth set aside the pies and pancakes, listened intently to the story. The girl had lost her mother early. She couldn't imagine how one could choose a groom between a fiancé and a family member. Elizabeth could not condemn either mother or daughter. It seemed to her that a compromise should have been made, but it was easy to reason when the situation didn't concern you. Anyway, after a few months, Lucy regretted everything she'd said. The daughter did not answer the phone and did not come to visit, finished the story Mary Adams. And then Lucy decided to move to the city. Hoped that at least there she will have the opportunity to meet with her daughter. But where Catherine went, she didn't know. So now I don't know if they ever met. "Somehow I'm dying to know," Elizabeth said suddenly. "I have the address. I'll go and ask. And at the same time I'll confess that I've taken over her house." Elizabeth was telling the truth. The thought occurred to her as soon as she read the letter. She wanted to hug the poor woman and feel sorry for her. But she didn't have enough money for the journey. The town was farther away from the village than the one Elizabeth lived in. Therefore, the ticket would cost more. But Mary Adams offered to help her again. Elizabeth was embarrassed, but she would not refuse. The girl was still sure that she would not be in this predicament forever. One day she would have the opportunity to pay back everyone who was helping her. Elizabeth went to Lucy's the next morning. She was ready to go earlier, but the bus left only once a day in the early morning. The girl wondered on the way what she would say to the woman, why she had even considered this trip. But the bus was already pulling up to the train station. It was too late to change her mind. It took Elizabeth about 2 hours to find the right address, and now she stood in front of the door to Lucy's apartment. She tentatively pressed the bell, but it didn't work. Elizabeth already thought that this was a sign that she should go back to the village and continue to think about her own problems, and not solve other people's. But no, she hadn't come all this way just to be scared and come back with nothing. Elizabeth still didn't know why she had come here in the first place or what she would say. But she knocked on the door. No one opened, though Elizabeth knocked several times, and for quite a while. She even thought she heard footsteps outside the door, but no one ever opened. Just as Elizabeth turned around, there was a thud in the apartment, as if something or someone had fallen. There was no doubt about it, the sound came from behind the door behind her. Elizabeth couldn't leave, so she risked opening the door to see if anything was wrong in the apartment and if she needed help. The knob came down and the lock opened. Elizabeth pushed the door open and immediately saw a woman on the floor in the hallway. She seemed to be having a stroke. The girl was frightened. She didn't even have a cell phone to call an ambulance. But Lucy pointed to the kitchen. Elizabeth immediately went where the woman showed her and saw a smartphone on the table. The ambulance came 10 minutes later. Elizabeth went with Lucy to the hospital, spent about an hour in the corridor until the doctor came out to her. "She's fine," the doctor said. "You called the paramedics just in time." Elizabeth breathed a sigh of relief, and then the doctor said that they had already spoken to the patient's daughter. They told her that an unknown girl had come to the hospital. Catherine said she'd be here within the hour. She asked you to wait for her, the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," the doctor said. "I'll wait for her," Elizabeth replied calmly. She had nowhere to be in a hurry. She thought it would be a great opportunity to reconcile mother and daughter. She was even glad that Katie had decided to come after all. She didn't ignore her mother's problems. So it wasn't too late. Katie arrived quickly, less than an hour later. She ran straight to Elizabeth and knelt down in front of her. "Don't be. That's what anyone in my position would do," Elizabeth said, embarrassed. "The doctor said you saved Mom's life," Katie said, getting up from her knees. "I don't know who you are or how you know my mom, but I'm grateful to you. Ask for anything you want." "Come on, I don't need anything. Will you forgive your mother?" Elizabeth said and handed her the letter she had found in the house. "I didn't go to your mother's house of my own free will. There was this note. It was meant for you, I take it?" Catherine took the sheet, read her mother's message, which had been waiting for almost a year in her home. She couldn't hold back her tears as she read the words written in neat handwriting. Elizabeth noticed the look of guilt, shame, and unspeakable pain in Katie's eyes. How could I have forgotten about her? She could have died alone, Katie said, sinking down on the bench beside Elizabeth. But how did you end up in her house and apartment? The doctor reported that Mama had been taken from the city apartment, not the village. Elizabeth was ashamed to admit that she had moved into Lucy's house without her knowledge. But she saw Kathy as a good and kind person who would certainly not judge her. So Elizabeth decided to tell her the whole story from the beginning, so that Katie would have no more questions for her. It was an accident of fate, Catherine said when Elizabeth had finished her story. Stay the night at your mother's in the village. You can't leave tonight anyway, and she will be in the hospital for weeks. Tomorrow morning I will come to visit you and we will talk. Elizabeth thanked the kind girl. She really hadn't thought at all about where she would stay. The buses traveled once a day, not only to the city but also from the city. So she could either walk to the village, which would take her a long time, or take a cab, which Elizabeth simply didn't have the money for. Catherine not only allowed her mother's savior to stay with her, but drove her to the familiar driveway. I'll be there at 9, Katie said goodbye. I hope you won't be asleep by then. Elizabeth re-entered the apartment she had been in for only a few minutes. She found it cozy, but everything about it suggested that it belonged to a lonely and deeply unhappy woman. There were many framed photographs on the shelves. Each picture was of Catherine at a different time in her life. On one was a baby, on another a first grader with puffy bows, on the third already a graduate in a beautiful ball gown. Lucy loved her daughter and missed her in a strange apartment. It wasn't easy for Elizabeth to get comfortable. She had to get used to the idea that she had no corner of her own now. The girl thought a lot about Catherine, what she wanted to talk to her about, but there was no point in guessing. The only thing left to do was to wait until morning to see if Catherine had been deceived. Catherine knocked on the door at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Elizabeth was surprised that the girl knocked. She was not the mistress of the house, so Catherine could have entered her house unannounced. But Elizabeth even asked permission to enter and clarified exactly where they could set up to talk. "Mother is feeling better and would like to thank you," Catherine said as she sat down at the table in the kitchen. Elizabeth poured tea, but there was nothing else she could offer her guest. She even took the tea bag without asking. "If you don't mind, we'll go to the hospital after we talk," Catherine said. "Of course, I also have to thank your mother after all to get to know her. I'm her lodger." It turned out that Catherine was floundering, did not know how to get to what she wanted to talk about. Elizabeth guessed that Lucy wasn't the topic of conversation. "I remember you telling me your story yesterday," Catherine began to say. "You were running a successful business, and I found some articles about you on the internet. It's amazing that a businesswoman like you could be so foolishly deceived." "I trusted both Ben and my husband," Elizabeth replied, feeling an inexplicable sense of guilt. "I was just intimidated and confused. They were people I didn't expect to be set up at all." "Don't think I'm trying to shame you or make fun of you," Catherine said, as she realized that her words might have sounded like mockery. "Quite the opposite. I would like to discuss some details with you. I have a proposition for you that you'll like, especially given the position you're in." Elizabeth raised her head and squared her shoulders. Her whole appearance showed that she was ready to listen to the terms and offers. Catherine immediately saw in front of her a strong woman, a real businesswoman. Until then, Elizabeth seemed to her as a lost girl. But her ex-husband and assistant could not bury in her a confident businesswoman. "I wasn't, and I'll be honest about it," Catherine said. Before voicing her proposal, or even a request, Catherine told the backstory. She admitted that she married a man who was 18 years older than her. Mary Adams got it a little wrong, but she entered into marriage for love. Catherine also revealed that this was the reason why she and her mom had a fight. Elizabeth was silent about the fact that she was already aware that she was the cause of discord between mother and daughter. "2 months ago, my husband passed away," Catherine said sadly. "No sooner had I recovered from this loss, although not yet, to be honest, as I had to face a new problem, the heirs. Other than our mutual son, only 3 years old, my spouse had no children. His business has passed to me. But I don't understand anything about it. I am afraid that I too could be cheated by assistants and accountants and other employees. Anybody could set me up because I don't understand anything about the paperwork. So I would be very happy if you would become my right hand. Teach me how to run the business and help me get the company out. Because with me at the helm, my late husband's company is going downhill." Elizabeth was pleased that Catherine had decided to entrust her with such a responsible task, even knowing that she herself was dressed like a little girl. She even asked Catherine if she was embarrassed by that fact. "Not at all," Catherine replied calmly. "You've been running a successful business for several years. I read that you built your company from scratch. Why can't you promote an established and successful business? Personal motives played into your business. You were deceived by people close to you. I have a different situation. I'd be happy to help you." Elizabeth agreed. Catherine hugged her new acquaintance, thanked her for this answer, offered Elizabeth to immediately give an advance payment so that she could rent an apartment, settle in for the first time, buy food, new clothes. After the conversation, the girls went to Lucy's hospital, where the woman tearfully thanked Elizabeth for saving her life. But she was even more grateful for reconciling with her daughter. After her first day of work, which was Elizabeth's abbreviated day, she drove to the village. The purpose of the trip was one thing: to talk to Mary Adams, to settle her debts. Elizabeth couldn't even figure out what Mary Adams was happier about: the fact that her new neighbor had done well and found a job, or that Lucy had reconciled with her daughter. The woman did not want to accept money from Elizabeth, but she said she would be offended and would not forgive herself if Mary did not accept her debt. Elizabeth also wanted to visit the stall clerk, who was also kind to her. But she had to go to another town for that, not the one where she had settled. Now she didn't want to spend half a day on the bus, so Elizabeth decided that she would thank her when she bought a car. By the way, she was able to do so after 6 months. All, in the entire 6 months, Elizabeth had almost completely recovered from her collapse. She became not just an assistant and business consultant for Catherine, she became the second person in her company. The girls were able to not only save the business, but powerfully propel it forward. Catherine was well aware that without Elizabeth's help she could not have done it, and therefore generously thanked the girl with a high salary. Elizabeth had not lost her entrepreneurial spirit. She tried not to waste a lot of money. After she bought an apartment and a car, she started saving for her own business. It was not the first time she started from scratch. She'd already managed to start a business once and create a successful construction firm. So she would do it again. It took the girl 3 years to get back on her feet. She was still a long way from her previous fortune, but last time it had taken her years to get her business off the ground. Now, however, things were progressing much faster. Elizabeth did not forget Mary Adams and the saleswoman, who had been kind to her. She had paid off the second one too, and they had even managed to chat. The woman at the stall was named Tatiana, and she told her that she was deeply unhappy. Her own son had died in a hot spot, and she was all alone. Elizabeth had no idea how many lonely women there were in the world. She thought about the fact that there was no one to take care of them. For example, Mary Adams complained that she herself had to chop wood for the winter, shovel snow, go for water. It is not good for an old woman to do such hard labor. When Elizabeth had her own business and money, she thought about creating a foundation. The girl found volunteers who agreed to help old people and single women with hard physical labor on a free basis. The news of such a fund quickly spread around the city. Elizabeth was even interviewed for the regional channel. Christopher got up early to prepare for the meeting. The company wasn't doing as well as Elizabeth. He was nervous. The partners were refusing to cooperate. If at first no one cared who was at the helm of Elizabeth's company, after a while they realized that there was a difference. Christopher had never been a businessman, and things were not going well for him. He couldn't get organized on one level of his company. There was no way Ben could single-handedly pull the firm off the bottom, and so far they were still afloat. But the outlook for the next few years was bleak. Added to the fact that Christopher not only didn't know how to earn money, he spent it recklessly. And he had an assistant in the form of Sandy. This young beauty didn't worry about money at all. The money from her card, and consequently from Christopher's accounts, flew away like leaves from trees in the fall. Christopher had a habit of eating breakfast with the news. It was a habit he'd had since his days at the car service center. He brewed his coffee, set a plate of freshly cooked scrambled eggs in front of him, and turned up the volume on the TV. Just as he took the first sip of the aromatic, invigorating coffee, the drink immediately spurted out in a fountain onto the table. The thing was, he saw a familiar face on the TV. Elizabeth, in an expensive suit, beautifully styled and wearing expensive jewelry, was talking about her charitable foundation. She was definitely doing well. After the interview, the announcer talked about how Elizabeth is a successful entrepreneur and is already moving the local rich people from the top position. How is that possible? I ripped her off. Christopher said out loud, "If a man has brains, he is not lost in the world," said Sandy, who had just woken up to the smell of coffee. "That can't be said for you." Christopher was furious when he heard his lover's words. He reminded her that she wasn't exactly frugal either and had contributed significantly to their ruin. "I thought you were going to be a businessman," she said unashamedly. "Money is supposed to work and multiply itself, and for some reason you have only disadvantages. You should learn from your ex." The man could not stand such insults and obvious mockery from the girl, grabbed her by the hair and pushed her out into the street right in her pajamas. She shrieked, begging to be let go, but Christopher couldn't stop. She had hurt him too much with her remarks. Christopher was already thinking that his mistress had stopped seeing boundaries. More than once she had made insulting remarks about Christopher, especially if she didn't have enough money for new jewelry or dresses. Sandy could only demand and judge. It was impossible to get support and help from her. "Come to my place and get your sister out of here," Christopher told Ben over the phone. "What do you mean, take her away?" Ben didn't understand. "Literally, I don't need her anymore. I'm going back to my wife, and Sandy's standing outside the fence in her pajamas. And the longer you drive, the longer she'll have to walk down the street in God's pajamas." Christopher replied and hung up the phone. He wasn't joking or speaking in haste. He really intended to get Elizabeth back. He couldn't handle the business alone. The money would soon run out, and Elizabeth was obviously doing well. He thought that his ex-wife would immediately forgive him and take him back. All the more reason for him to return everything to her, provided she agreed to remarry him. Before leaving for another city, Christopher thought that Ben might harm him in some way. So he decided to fire the assistant and informed him about it by phone. "You realize that without me, the end of your empire will come even faster." Ben answered him, who was also furious that his sister had been thrown out on the street like an unwanted kitten. "Don't worry, my ex-wife will fix my affairs," Christopher answered, starting the engine. "She would have fired you anyway. No one would want to work with a traitor." He hung up. Ben looked at his sister, who still couldn't get warm in the car. Did he seriously think Elizabeth would forgive him and welcome him back with open arms? Sandy asked through gritted teeth. "No, of course not. She's not stupid," Ben told her. "But we can try to gain her trust and punish the bastard." "What city does she live in now? Did you see it on the news?" Sandy nodded. Ben smiled and stepped on the gas. He and his sister are going to Elizabeth's place too. Just need to change their sister's clothes first. Ben decided that the mistress shouldn't be taken to see Elizabeth. She would be more able to confide in him without her. Sandy didn't insist. She didn't feel like traveling across town, but she advised her brother to call Elizabeth, because Christopher would definitely be there sooner. Elizabeth enjoyed the beautiful morning. Even though it was getting close to lunchtime, she'd given herself a chance to get some sleep that day. She and Catherine had had a party the night before to celebrate a successful transaction. The peaceful flow of the morning routine was broken by a phone call. Elizabeth had hoped to hear anyone but the man who had left her in the lurch a few years ago. "Ben?" Elizabeth said questioningly. "Did you get the wrong number?" "No. I want to warn you that another man from the past is coming to see you soon," the man said seriously, though his knees were trembling with excitement. "Your ex-husband has found out you're back on the horse and wants to suck on your income. Christopher himself couldn't replicate your success. He's almost out of money." Elizabeth replied that's what she thought. But Ben is worried for nothing. The girl would never forgive her ex-husband in her life, would never believe him. "I understand that." Unlike him, he laughed. "You want to get back at him, don't you? I have an idea." "I'm not surprised you have another plan to trick a man." Elizabeth's former assistant jabbed at him as well. "What I don't understand is, why would you want to do that? I mean, you two are kind of related, and even related." And Ben told him what Christopher had done to him and his sister. So he had a strong motive for revenge, too. Elizabeth still agreed to listen to his plan. She found his arguments convincing. Elizabeth was also attracted to the fact that this time her safety would not be threatened. So this wasn't another scheme to take everything away from her. Elizabeth was even looking forward to hearing from her ex-husband. There was no way Christopher could think of a way for him to show up. He wanted to make sure his ex-spouse didn't guess his intentions, as if he didn't know she was rich again. Christopher tracked Elizabeth down, finding out where she lived and worked. As if by chance, he found himself in the same establishment where Elizabeth got her coffee every morning. "What meeting?" Christopher exclaimed, meeting Elizabeth there. Yes, unexpected indeed, Elizabeth played along, who had long known that her husband was tracking her. The guards had already reported to her a few days ago that a man was following her. Christopher asked Elizabeth how she was doing, telling her that he was doing fine except for his love life. "Wow, your mistress only wanted money." Elizabeth ironically repeated after him. "Is this boomerang coming back to you?" "It's not true, I wasn't with you for money." Christopher answered her resentfully. "Ben and his little sister tricked me. She seduced me, and he put me up to it." Elizabeth nodded, looking understanding. It looked very exaggerated, and Christopher could see the obvious mockery on his ex-wife's part. Nevertheless, he was pleased that she did not stop talking to him, listened immediately, and even entered into a dialogue. All of this Elizabeth had done deliberately. She needed to gain his trust so that Christopher would think she had fallen for his bait again. And she succeeded. After the first meeting, Christopher was sure that after a couple more conversations and dates, he would be a rich woman's husband again. And Elizabeth was happy to play along. Each time she forced herself to communicate with her ex-husband, but she realized that without it, her revenge would not happen. She needed to feign trust and warmth toward a man she couldn't stand. Listening to Christopher's words was simply unbearable for her. She realized that he was a masterful liar, and believe her, he really wanted to deceive. Even though she knew that every word he said was a lie. Christopher was getting more and more turned on because he couldn't tell if Elizabeth trusted him or not. It seemed to him that everything was happening too easily. Immediately, his ex-wife agreed to a date, answered his phone instantly. Was she so starved for a relationship, so lonely that she forgave him so easily? Christopher went on the offensive, sending her gifts, arranging surprises, dates. He thought she was about to melt. Elizabeth stepped over herself when she went to these meetings and smiled sweetly at her traitor husband. She was even more disgusted when she saw Christopher cowering before her, the bastard squealing. "Ben, I'm getting tired of these meetings with my ex-husband. When do we move on to the next phase of the plan?" Elizabeth asked him after another date. "We need to push Christopher into action. Until he's ready to give it all back to you, we're not going to get anywhere," Ben told her. "How do you push him to do that?" "I'm already pretending to be in love and forgiving all the wrongs," Elizabeth clarified. Next to Elizabeth at that moment was Catherine. She came to visit her to discuss personal matters. The girls had become not only business partners, but also best friends. "I have an idea," Catherine said suddenly. Elizabeth immediately put the call on speaker so that Ben could hear her. Men are most afraid of competition. If Christopher found out that Elizabeth had a suitor for his heart, he would immediately move into decisive action. Ben agreed that it was a good idea. As a man, he confirmed it. Katie then informed him that she had a good acquaintance who would agree to help her. Christopher didn't know how to propose to Elizabeth himself. He still doubted that she had finally forgiven him. Suddenly, he received a call on his work phone. Since Ben had been fired, Christopher scheduled all negotiations and meetings by himself. He received a call from a man who introduced himself as a well-known investor, and Christopher knew his name. It was a man named David. This was a weighty figure in their field. Many people knew him, and everyone dreamed of working with this man. Christopher even straightened his back, although the person on the phone still couldn't see him. Christopher prepared for the meeting with the investor as carefully as for a date. Until the last moment, he didn't believe that the David he had in mind would come to the meeting. But his expectations were justified. After a short negotiation, the businessmen shook hands, but David was in no hurry to leave. "Is it true that Elizabeth Igorevna is your ex-wife?" David suddenly asked. Christopher nodded and immediately tensed. This question did not bode well. David said that a friend of his was interested in the woman. "He begged me to find out if Elizabeth had a boyfriend," David said, blushing. "I'm sorry to bring it up." "That's all right," Christopher coughed. "It's good of you to ask. Elizabeth and I are discussing the possibility of starting a family right now. I want to propose to her because our feelings are back." "That's too bad, because my friend was going to take her out tonight," David said. "But then I'll tell him he has nothing to look forward to." "Yes, please do." Christopher's voice became high, like a frightened boy's. Christopher waited until David left the restaurant and immediately called Elizabeth, asking her not to plan anything for the evening. He had a serious conversation to have. Wow, that worked so fast. Elizabeth was surprised. She knew at once that Christopher had prepared a serious conversation. He had dressed like a real groom, prepared a huge bouquet, and was very excited. Elizabeth sank into a chair and showed that she was ready to listen to him. Christopher pulled some papers out of his briefcase, got down on one knee, and handed Elizabeth the ring. I want it all back, he said, to prove that he was serious. I have prepared the documents that will give you everything back, everything that I took away. You will be my wife again. Elizabeth did not hurry to take the ring, open the folder with the documents, read them carefully, every line, every word. When she was sure that this time there was no deceit, she put her signature in the right places. When did you have time to prepare them? She was surprised. But I was on my way to you with them, Christopher said. You can see the date I wrote and signed them. It shows that I'm serious. While Elizabeth read the papers, Christopher remained on one knee with his arm outstretched. He was very worried. But since the girl signed the papers, then the deed is done. It's a shame that you're giving me back much less than you took, Elizabeth began to say. And Christopher immediately realized that he was too happy too soon. And I gave you the company in a very different state of mind. But thank you for that. You can offer your ring to Sandy. I don't need anything else from you, if that's what it takes. I'll make a deal with the police, just like you did. I was wiser this time. Elizabeth took the folder with the documents, got up from the table and left the restaurant. Christopher remained sitting on one knee. He could not believe his ears. He now found himself in Elizabeth's shoes. She had tricked him too. A waiter approached Christopher, asking if he wanted to pay the bill. What bill? Yelled at the kid, furious. Didn't you see that? Didn't she just take everything from me? How am I supposed to pay for it? The waiter was startled by this reaction, but kept his cool. He asked the man to calm down and told him that he would have to call security, and maybe even the police if Christopher didn't pull himself together and pay for his order. But he had no intention of calming down. Christopher was furious. He was realizing more and more every second that he had literally become a tramp. He threw all sorts of unflattering words at Elizabeth, who could no longer hear him. He started smashing everything, breaking chairs, tables, and sweeping dishes from the tables of other visitors. But he was quickly calmed down and tied up by the guards. Christopher, why did you embarrass yourself like that? You are a respectable man, said the owner of the restaurant. While the bound Christopher and the staff waited for the police, the man's words echoed in Christopher's mind. He remembered how, years ago, he had asked Elizabeth to calm down and not embarrass herself by throwing her fists at him in the middle of the street. He could understand her pain now, her feelings. Only the girl was much more hurt and offended. She had been robbed of her hard-earned blood and sweat, and he had been robbed of something that had never belonged to him. It was cold and calculated revenge, and Christopher accepted defeat. He decided that now he would definitely settle down, go back to his car service. He could try on a rich life and realize that money doesn't just fall out of the sky. He had everything, but he couldn't save it. When Elizabeth walked out of the restaurant, she raised the folder above her head and shouted with joy. And in the car already waiting for her was Katie, who immediately ran out of the car, hugged her friend. The girls went to celebrate their victory in the club. On the way to the club, Elizabeth called Ben and told him that the deed was done. Christopher was left with nothing, and she got back all her own. The man was pleased with the outcome, even venturing to ask if Elizabeth would hire him again. No, I've had enough of this once, Elizabeth laughed. I am grateful for your help. I can send you some money to thank you and pay you for your work, for warning me, but you can't expect more than that. I'm sorry, once a man has betrayed you, you can't trust him. Only enough talk, exclaimed a happy Katie. We were already at the club. Elizabeth said goodbye, hung up the phone, and looked at the huge building with its thousands of lights on. She had never been to such places, but her friend reassured her that it was a decent place and only rich people vacationed there. And there David was waiting for them. Elizabeth did not know about it. She did not even communicate with him. This Catherine agreed about everything with her friend, and the meeting at the club was organized by her at David's request. The man had long been interested in this young, successful businesswoman. He himself was also young and attractive, but had no success in his personal life. All the girls who literally hung around his neck did not seem worthy to him. Many needed money. Their behavior was not distinguished by modesty. And David wanted to find a decent girl, whom he would see as his future wife and mother of his children. Elizabeth seemed to him just like that, and he fell in love with her at first sight. David later admits to Elizabeth that he could hardly hold a conversation with her ex-husband. He disliked liars and cheaters so much But when he looked at Christopher and realized that this man had caused a lot of pain to this beautiful girl, the urge to punch him in the face was self-inflicted. Catherine didn't bother to tell Elizabeth that David was actually interested in her friend. The girl wasn't sure if her buddy was ready for a relationship. She hadn't promised David anything except that she would introduce them. And the introduction was a success. Elizabeth was in a good mood, smiling, almost bouncing with happiness. And David just couldn't contain his smile as he watched such a happy and therefore even more beautiful Elizabeth. "I owe you one," Elizabeth said happily to David. "How did you manage to convince my ex-husband that I had a boyfriend and he signed everything back over to me the same day?" "Men don't like competition," David answered her with a smile. "But I wasn't lying about your suitor. I do have one." David blushed, but because of the darkness in the club, Elizabeth didn't notice it. The confident, successful man who runs a dozen businesses felt at that moment like a schoolboy shy of talking to a girl. Elizabeth danced and behaved casually, not even realizing that her interlocutor was burning with shame and shaking with embarrassment. "Then introduce me to him. What if this is my destiny?" Elizabeth laughed, who was in a great mood, and said it not seriously, more as a joke. But David literally blossomed before her eyes. When he heard these words, Elizabeth, he began to correct his jacket and hair, and then extended his hand to the girl. Elizabeth stopped dancing at this metamorphosis. She looked at David seriously, trying to determine whether she understood correctly what would happen next. "Then let me introduce myself. I am the admirer," he said with contrived importance. It looked ridiculous again, because the man was terribly shy. He tried to give the impression of a serious man, but his excitement was getting in the way. Elizabeth was confused at this point, but she shook his hand. David was a handsome man, and outwardly Elizabeth was attracted to him. But the girl did not think about serious and non-serious relationships. It seemed to her that after her first marriage, she would remain a loner forever. Catherine watched from the side how her friend and old comrade communicate. She really wanted Elizabeth to find her happiness, and she knew for a fact that David was the perfect match. He would definitely not be with Elizabeth for the money. He is a loyal and decent man. Those were the arguments she made to her friend the next day. Elizabeth embarrassed. She too was well aware of what an important and powerful businessman David was. She couldn't believe she could be looked up to by a man of such high rank. "And you're not an ordinary girl," either Katie told her. "There's nothing to be surprised about. Give David a chance, you'll never meet anyone like him again." And Elizabeth heeded her friend's advice. She went on a few dates with David, accepted gifts and advances from him, and eventually they formed a beautiful couple. A year and a half later, Elizabeth and David became a family. Elizabeth did meet Christopher. It was unexpected. She had a flat tire somewhere on the outskirts of town, namely near a tire shop. Elizabeth even laughed that the owners of the tire shop had put something on the road just to get a customer. Never before had there been such an expensive car in this godforsaken place. Unfortunately, the owner's only employee was a half-drunk Christopher. Elizabeth recognized him immediately and said she wouldn't let him near the car. She called David and asked him to come and get her in the car. But while she waited for her husband, she decided to talk to Christopher. He told her without much enthusiasm that he had been working at the place since he was released from the police. After the debauch in the restaurant, he lived in a dormitory, and the only joy in his life was a bottle of vodka. Christopher watched with hatred and envy as Elizabeth got into David's car and they drove off to their happy life. "To each his own," Christopher said, his voice hoarse with hangover. "And we haven't lived rich. There's no reason to start."